Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I don't sleep much. Never have really. When I was younger, it was just insomnia, but over the years, sleep paralysis made it unbearable. Waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move, feeling like something was in the room with me. It was enough to make me avoid sleeping altogether. Most nights, I stayed up as late as I could, either gaming, watching random YouTube videos, or just killing time. Eventually, though, I'd get restless, and since I smoked, I had an excuse to head out. There was a gas station just down the road from my apartment, a short walk if I didn't feel like driving. The guy who worked the graveyard shift there, I got to know him pretty well. He was quiet, not the social type, which I appreciated because I wasn't either. I have pretty bad social anxiety, so it was rare for me to actually talk to someone face to face and feel comfortable. But he and I clicked, mostly talking about gaming and random shit to pass the time. Some nights, I'd hang around for an hour or two just to keep him company. That night, it was late, around 3 in the morning. October, close to Halloween. In a college town like mine, that meant seeing drunk people wandering around in half-assed costumes or wearing masks for no reason. It wasn't weird, just the usual. I drove there instead of walking. It wasn't that far, but I was feeling lazy. The parking lot was mostly empty when I pulled in. Just one other car parked at the far end near the air pump. Probably a random, nothing out of the ordinary. I left my engine running for a second, just sitting there, staring at the gas station sign flickering above the door. The inside was lit up bright like it always was, empty except for the clerk behind the counter. I grabbed my wallet, stepped out, and the cold air hit me. It wasn't freezing, but it had that sharp, crisp feeling you get at night in the fall, where you can tell winter isn't too far off. The door chimed when I walked in. The clerk glanced up and gave a small nod. I went straight for what I came for, a pack of smokes and a drink. I wasn't in a rush though. I figured I'd hang around like I usually did, shoot the shit for a while before heading back home. The place was quiet. The shelves looked mostly stocked. The floor had that faint smell of old mop water, and the buzzing from the fluorescent lights filled the empty air. It was familiar, comfortable in a way. I set my stuff on the counter, but before the clerk could ring it up, the door chimed again. I barely glanced over. Just a quick look out of habit. Some guy in a hoodie walked in. Hood pulled up, red bandana covering most of his face. Nothing weird. Like I said, it was close to Halloween, so seeing someone dressed like that wasn't anything strange. Probably some college kid screwing around. I turned back toward the counter. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. Chrome. Small. Didn't register what it was at first. My brain just didn't make the connection fast enough. And then it did. A fucking gun. By the time I actually understood what I was looking at, it was already pointed at me. A long barrel, silver. Later, I'd remember it was a .357 Magnum. At the time, all I saw was the hole at the end, a perfect circle aimed directly at my head. I froze. Everything in my body locked up instantly, like my brain was still trying to convince me I was seeing something else. Like maybe this was some joke. Some prank. It wasn't. Hands up. I did. The clerk did too. The guy didn't waste time. He moved straight toward the register, gesturing with the gun, telling the clerk to open it. No yelling. No screaming. Just a calm, steady tone. It made it worse somehow. Like this wasn't a big deal to him. Just another night. I was breathing hard, heart hammering so fast I felt it in my throat. I kept my hands up, barely moving, barely blinking. My legs felt locked in place, like if I moved even an inch, the gun would go off. The register popped open. The clerk reached in and started grabbing the bills, putting them on the counter. The guy snatched them up, stuffing them into the pocket of his hoodie. He wasn't in a rush, but he wasn't dragging it out either. Efficient. In and out. Then he turned to me. Empty your pockets. I hesitated, just for a second. Not because I didn't want to listen, but because I felt like my body had stopped working. My hands felt disconnected from my brain. I had my wallet in one pocket, my phone in the other. Slowly, I reached in and pulled them both out, placing them on the floor. The guy grabbed my phone, left my wallet. Then he stepped back, gesturing with the gun again. Bathroom. Both of you. 1,000 thoughts went through my head at once. Was he going to kill us? Was he going to lock us in? I had no idea. I walked. The clerk walked too. The guy followed, keeping the gun pointed at us until we stepped inside. Then the door shut. Silence. I stood there, my back against the wall, hands shaking. The clerk was next to me, breathing hard. Nothing happened. No gunshots. No footsteps. Just nothing. Then I heard the door chime. He was gone. I didn't move at first. My mind was still stuck, still frozen in that moment. Then slowly, I stepped forward and pushed the bathroom door open. The store was empty. And right there, scattered on the floor leading toward the door, was a trail of cigarettes. Like an idiot, the guy had dropped nearly everything he'd stolen. And just a few feet outside, near the curb, was my phone. He must have fumbled it while making his getaway. I grabbed it immediately, checking it over. It was fine. We called the cops. They came fast, took our statements, checked the cameras. But the guy was already long gone. The footage showed him running out, then disappearing past the parking lot. They never caught him. For weeks after, I kept thinking about it. About how easy it had been, how fast it happened, how close I was to getting shot, and how little it would have taken for the night to go differently. If I had hesitated more, if the clerk had refused to open the register, if the guy had just decided he didn't want witnesses. I still go to that gas station, but I don't linger anymore, and I don't go at 3 a.m. When I was a freshman in high school, I didn't think much about death. It was something that happened in movies, something that happened to other people, something I knew was real, but not something I had to deal with directly. It wasn't part of my daily thoughts. But that changed when my mom's friend, Em, lost her father. Em had been through a lot already. Her first husband had died of cancer years before, and from what my mom told me, her childhood wasn't great either. Life had been cruel to her in a way that felt almost deliberate, like she was trapped in some endless cycle of grief. But things were looking up for her. She was engaged again, and my mom was excited to finally meet her fiancé B at the funeral. It was supposed to be a sad day, of course, but also a day of support, a day where people could come together and remind Em that she wasn't alone. That's how my mom saw it, at least. She had spent the days leading up to the funeral talking about how she hoped Em was holding up okay, how she was eager to see her, how she wanted to be there for her. And most of all, how she was finally going to meet B, the man who had brought some light back into Em's life. The night before the funeral, I had a dream. It wasn't like any normal dream I'd had before. Usually my dreams were nonsense, random things stitched together, flashes of memories mixed with things that never actually happened. But this was different. It was raining. Heavy, relentless rain. I remember standing somewhere outside, the sound of the water hitting the ground, the way the sky felt like it was pressing down. Then my grandfather was there. I never met him. He died 2 years before I was born, but I had seen pictures. My mom talked about him sometimes, not a lot, but enough for me to know that she had loved him deeply. And in this dream, he was there, clear as day, standing in the rain, looking at me like he had something important to say. I don't remember the exact way he said it, but the message was clear. He told me to tell my mom hello, and to mention the plane crash to Em. It didn't make sense. There was no explanation, no details, nothing. Just that one instruction. And then the dream ended. When I woke up, the first thing I felt was unease. I don't usually remember my dreams, but this one stuck with me. It was vivid, and it left me with that strange, lingering feeling, like I had just been told something I wasn't supposed to ignore. I found my mom right before she was about to leave for the funeral. I wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding ridiculous, but I just told her what happened. I told her about the dream, about my grandfather, about what he said. I could tell right away that she didn't take it seriously. She thought it was just a coincidence, something weird but ultimately meaningless. She left for the funeral. The day went on as usual. Nothing happened. A week passed. Then my mom called me. I could hear something in her voice before she even said the words. Something shaky, something I had never heard from her before. She wasn't just shocked. She was shaken. Em had just called her. B had died. A private plane crash in Canada. It didn't register at first. It was too strange, too surreal. I didn't even know how to react, because it was like my brain was trying to reject what I was hearing. My mom wasn't the type to believe in things like fate or premonitions, but I could tell she was struggling with this. It was too specific. Too much of a coincidence. She kept going over the details, telling me how she had just talked to Em, how she was in total disbelief, how everything felt like some cruel joke, like the universe had just decided that Em wasn't allowed to have happiness. She kept saying she didn't understand. She kept saying it didn't make sense. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, my mom's words spilling out, and all I could think about was the rain in my dream, the way my grandfather had looked at me, the way I had dismissed it as nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It had been something, and I didn't understand how or why. Em had lost her fiancé in a plane crash. I had told my mom about a plane crash a week before it happened. It wasn't a dream I could forget. It wasn't something I could just brush off. It was real. It happened. And no matter how much I tried to make sense of it, I couldn't. The feeling it left me with never fully went away. I remember the heat of the sun pressing down on me as we hiked through the dry Utah landscape, the sky an unbroken stretch of blue. It had been 2 days of trekking through rough terrain, our gear weighing us down, dust clinging to every inch of our skin. The heat was relentless, and water was something we constantly had to ration. The group was a mix of experienced climbers and people like me, enthusiastic but far from experts. Rick, our de facto leader, had been the one to plan this trip. He was the most experienced and confident, carrying himself with the kind of certainty that made people trust him without question. We all relied on him to get us through the descent and out safely. We had met Joe at a small climbers cafe just before we started our journey. He was an older guy, middle-aged with graying hair, and had been sitting by himself with his gear packed neatly beside him. He told us he was heading to the same cave, and it only made sense to team up. He had a fair amount of equipment on him, and extra gear never hurt. He seemed quiet, serious, and when he spoke, it was clear he knew what he was doing. Still, I remember feeling skeptical. Something about him made me uneasy, though I couldn't place why. By the time we reached the entrance to the cave, exhaustion had already set in. My muscles ached from the hike, my legs heavy, but there was no time to rest. We had to start our descent before we lost daylight. The cave system was deep, a twisting network of tunnels, some barely wide enough to squeeze through. Before we even began, Joe muttered that he had a bad feeling. We brushed it off, told him not to jinx us, laughed it away. He shrugged, suited up, and didn't bring it up again. The cave swallowed us quickly. At first, it was a slow, careful descent. The walls were slick in some places, rough in others. The deeper we went, the colder it became. Water dripped from the ceiling, collecting in pools along the ground. The air smelled stale, untouched. The deeper we went, the less sound there was, just the distant drip of water and the occasional scrape of gear against rock. We moved through narrow passages, crawling in some places, shimmying through tight gaps in others. Every step was careful, deliberate. The deeper we went, the more the light from the entrance faded behind us, until the only illumination came from our headlamps. We had been descending for hours when it happened. At first, it was just a sound, low, deep, like a distant hum. I thought maybe it was the wind or the shifting of the cave walls. Then it grew louder, a vibration that I could feel in my chest. A sudden rush of cold air hit us, sending a shiver down my spine. That's when Joe lost it. His headlamp jerked wildly as he turned, his voice echoing through the chamber. Run. He was already moving, his boots slamming against the wet stone, water splashing beneath him. I hesitated for half a second, confused, before realizing what was happening. The sound wasn't the wind. It was water. A flash flood. I ran. The walls blurred around me as I pushed forward, my legs burning with effort. The narrow tunnel forced us into single file, each person struggling to keep moving. The water hit fast. It started at my ankles, then my knees, rising so quickly it didn't seem real. Within seconds, it was up to my waist, the force of it pulling at me, making every step harder. The cold was shocking, an icy grip that made my muscles stiffen. The sound of the rushing water was deafening, drowning out the shouts of the others. Ahead, I saw Tracy freeze. She stood motionless, her body locked in panic, blocking the way for the 5 of us behind her. The water kept rising. Dave yanked her forward, and we kept moving, but the flood was relentless. By the time we reached the next chamber, the water was at my chest. The passage we had entered opened into a larger space, but the relief was short-lived. Water was still pouring in, rising fast. We needed higher ground, somewhere safe. That's when Joe yelled for us to get into the crevices. There were small ledges along the walls, just high enough to keep us out of the rising water. One by one, we scrambled up, pressing ourselves into the narrow spaces. The water kept coming. It climbed higher and higher, inching toward us, filling the chamber, threatening to consume everything. We sat there, shivering, watching as the water crept closer. The girls sobbed quietly. The guys were silent, lost in their thoughts. I could barely process what was happening. My mind raced, thinking about everything and nothing all at once. How long would we be stuck here? Would the water ever stop? How deep were we? How long would it take for someone to find us? Would they find us at all? But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the water stopped rising. The roar of the flood faded into silence, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing. The chamber was nearly full, but not enough to drown us. We were alive. The next challenge was getting out. We were trapped in a deep chamber, surrounded by water. The only way forward was up, but climbing out wasn't something we could do without gear. We needed anchors, ropes, something to help us ascend. That's when we realized the truth. Rick, our supposed leader, the one who had planned everything, had brought the wrong gear. Or maybe he had forgotten a crucial piece. Either way, we were stuck. But Joe had what we needed. The man we had met by chance, the one we had almost dismissed, was the reason we got out. He had the right equipment, the right knowledge, the right instincts. He worked quickly, setting up anchors, securing ropes. Without him, we would have been trapped for days. And in those freezing temperatures, someone, probably Tracy, wouldn't have survived. The climb out was brutal. Every movement was exhausting. Our bodies were stiff from the cold, our muscles weak. We had to be careful, deliberate. A single mistake could mean slipping back into the water, and there was no way we would have the strength to climb out a second time. But slowly, inch by inch, we made our way up. By the time we reached the surface, the sun was blinding. I collapsed onto the ground, my body aching, my lungs desperate for fresh air. It was over. We had made it. The journey back to the cars took another 2 days. 2 days of exhaustion, of silence, of processing what had happened. No one talked much. There was nothing to say. We had come terrifyingly close to dying in that cave. If Joe hadn't been there, we might not have made it out at all. I don't know what happened to him after that. We parted ways at the parking lot. A few short words exchanged before he loaded his gear into his truck and drove off. I never saw him again, but I'll never forget him, and I'll never forget that cave. My roommate and I had been struggling to find a new place for weeks. Our lease on the old apartment was up, and we'd already overstayed by a month, pushing our luck with the landlord. Every listing we found was either too expensive, too far from our jobs, or gone before we could even schedule a viewing. The stress was starting to get to us, scrolling through rental apps at all hours, sending out emails that never got responses, debating if we could afford to sign a lease we weren't fully comfortable with. It was exhausting. Then we found this place. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was available, and we needed something fast. The house was old and beat up, but it was huge. High ceilings, massive rooms, a big backyard, close to work, and since it was still being fixed up, we were able to negotiate a lower rent. The owner had already replaced the appliances, but the place itself was filthy. The floors were covered in grime, the wallpaper was peeling, and dust coated everything. The furniture left behind was old and heavy, the kind you'd find in an antique shop, but not the nice kind, more like the kind that had been sitting there for decades because no one wanted it. Still, it was livable, and we weren't in a position to be picky. The first night, my roommate stayed at his girlfriend's place, leaving me alone in the house. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but I told myself it was no big deal. I'd lived alone before. It was just one night. I spent the evening unpacking, trying to make my room feel like my own, but it was hard to ignore how unsettling the house felt. The silence was thick, like the air was pressing down on me. Every creak, every rustle, every little sound made my skin crawl. I kept getting chills even though the heater was on. It felt like someone was watching me, but I was alone. I went to bed, exhausted but restless. The air in the room was stifling, and even though it was the middle of winter, I felt hot, sweating under my blanket. My skin itched like I'd walked through a patch of fiberglass insulation. Every time I drifted off, I woke up again, feeling like something was pinching me. It wasn't just a random twitch. It felt like tiny fingers pressing into my arms, my legs, my back. I kept brushing at my skin, but there was nothing there. The dreams were worse. I kept seeing an old woman standing in the corner of my room, wearing a white nightgown. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me. Her face was blank, expressionless, and the longer I looked at her, the closer she got. I'd wake up, heart pounding, gasping for air, only to fall back asleep and see her again, even closer this time. The cycle repeated until I jolted awake, because something had grabbed my ankle. My whole body jerked, and I kicked at nothing, scrambling to sit up. I didn't sleep after that. I turned on my phone, scrolled through pointless articles, played music, anything to break the silence. Eventually, the sun came up, and I forced myself to get out of bed, running on maybe an hour of actual sleep. Later that morning, our new neighbors stopped by. They were an older couple, friendly, the type who'd lived in the neighborhood forever. They told us they'd been in their house for 60 years, watching families come and go. When we mentioned how lucky we were to find the place, they gave each other a look. The house had been in the same family since it was built, they told us. Over 100 years. The last woman who lived there had spent almost her entire life in the house. She never married, never had kids, just stayed in the same house, growing old. In her final years, she'd had a private nurse, someone who was supposed to take care of her but, according to the neighbors, did a horrible job. The house fell apart under the nurse's care, and the woman herself was apparently neglected. She died in the house. I asked which room had been hers. The neighbors pointed to my bedroom. It made sense. The room had come with a giant bed, one of those heavy wooden ones with an ornate headboard. We hadn't moved it yet because it was massive, and getting it out would be a hassle. If she died in the house, it was probably in that bed. I didn't tell my roommate about the dreams. I didn't tell him about waking up feeling like something had grabbed me. He probably would have laughed it off anyway, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. But things kept happening. It wasn't big stuff, at least not at first. We'd hear each other moving around in the morning, but when one of us got up, the other was still in bed. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, thinking my roommate was up, but when I checked, his door was shut, and I could still hear him snoring inside. I'd come home and find my bedroom door unlocked. At first, I assumed I'd forgotten to lock it, but it kept happening. I started double-checking, making sure I turned the lock. Still, I'd come back, and the door would be open. Things would move. Not big things, just little stuff. My keys wouldn't be where I left them. A glass I'd set in the sink would be on the counter instead. I lost my phone charger 3 times before I finally found it in a drawer I never used. At night, I'd hear footsteps on the porch. Our house had a wraparound porch that extended to the backyard. My room had a door that led straight to it, which was great during the day but unnerving at night. The sound of someone walking back and forth, slow and deliberate, made my skin crawl. But every time I checked, there was no one there. One night, I heard it again. Footsteps. Heavy, slow. Pacing. I sat up in bed, listening. The porch light was off, and through the window, all I could see was darkness. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept to the door. I took a breath, unlocked it, and yanked it open. Nothing. The porch was empty. The backyard was still. I locked the door again and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. As the weeks passed, the house started to change. The contractors came in, tearing up the old floors, repainting the walls, getting rid of the old furniture. The heavy bed frame was finally hauled out, replaced with something newer. The grimy wallpaper was stripped away. The dust was gone. The house felt lighter, brighter. And then everything stopped. No more footsteps in the hall. No more waking up overheated and itchy. No more missing objects. No more unlocked doors. The feeling of being watched was gone. By the time the renovations were finished, the house was unrecognizable. It was beautiful, clean, fresh, full of life. The heaviness that had lingered for so long had lifted. It didn't feel like something was watching us anymore. But I still think about that first month. The dreams, the footsteps, the feeling of something grabbing me. I don't believe in ghosts, not really. But I believe places can hold on to things. And maybe whatever was there, whatever had been watching, had just been waiting for the house to be lived in again. Maybe it was waiting for the house to feel like home. Now it does. I used to spend almost every day at John's house. We'd known each other since middle school, but we really started hanging out regularly in high school. His house was small, a single-story place with a long, narrow hallway that connected the bedrooms to the living room. It was the kind of house that always felt dim inside, even during the day. The curtains were always drawn just enough to keep the rooms from ever feeling bright, and the air inside had this stillness to it, like no one had opened a window in years. At first, nothing seemed strange. We'd sit in his room, play video games, watch movies, and waste time like any other teenagers. But after a while, I started noticing little things that didn't seem to belong. I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, like a shadow slipping out of sight just as I turned my head. It wasn't a trick of the light, because it happened even when the room was dark. It wasn't a reflection, because there were no mirrors or glass nearby. Just the feeling of something there, something just outside of where I could fully see. And then there were the footsteps. Faint, sometimes barely noticeable. They came from the hallway most of the time, soft taps on the wooden floor, like someone walking just slow enough that it could be mistaken for the house settling. Sometimes I'd hear them when I was alone in the living room, waiting for John to grab something from his room. I never said anything at first. It felt stupid to bring it up. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe I wanted there to be something weird, because the house already had this slightly off-putting feel to it. Then one day, I finally mentioned it. I don't remember how it came up exactly, but I just said something about feeling like I was seeing things out of the corner of my eye. John stopped what he was doing immediately. He turned to me, his expression suddenly serious, like I had crossed some invisible line. He demanded to know who had told me. His voice was sharp, almost accusing, like I had said something personal I shouldn't have known about. I told him no one had told me anything. I was just saying what I'd noticed. He stared at me for a long second before looking away, shaking his head like he didn't want to believe me. He told me he had been seeing them for years, shadowy figures just outside his vision, moving through the house. At first, he thought they were his imagination, but they never went away. After that, everything got worse. It was like acknowledging them gave them permission to do more. The footsteps got louder. Sometimes we'd both hear them at the same time, and neither of us would say anything. Just look at each other and know that we weren't imagining it. Doors started shutting on their own. Not slamming, not in some dramatic way, just quietly closing, like someone had pressed them shut with their palm. The TV would turn itself on in the middle of the night, flickering through channels before settling on static. One time, we both heard laughter, soft, distant, coming from another room when we were the only ones home. It was the kind of laughter you don't mistake for the sound of the house settling. It was the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I didn't want to keep going over to his house after that. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was just paranoia, but I could feel the tension growing every time I stepped inside. I wasn't the only one. John was getting worse. He started sleeping with the lights on. He'd turn up the TV volume louder than normal, like he was trying to drown something out. He wouldn't walk down the hallway at night unless all the lights were on. One night, while we were sitting in the kitchen, I finally said we should bless the house. Not in some over-the-top, dramatic way. Just sprinkle some holy water, say a quick prayer. Before I could even finish my sentence, a box sitting on the counter flew off and landed right at my feet. It didn't just fall. It was like something had shoved it. I didn't move. John didn't move. We just sat there, staring at the box on the floor. I could hear my own breathing, the way it had suddenly become sharp, unsteady. John stood up without a word and went to his parents' room, digging through the drawers until he found an old vial of holy water. I didn't even know he had it. We went through the house, sprinkling it in every room. Neither of us spoke, but I could tell we both felt the same thing, that thick, pressing tension, like something was watching us. I kept waiting for something else to happen, for another box to fly off, for something to whisper in my ear. But nothing happened, and after that, the house went quiet. I still went over to John's place after that, but less often. Part of me felt like we had done the right thing, but another part of me didn't want to be there anymore. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was just this deep exhaustion, like I had spent too much time in a place I shouldn't have been. Months passed, and we planned a weekend at my family's lake house. It was supposed to be a break, a way to relax, just me and John. I had nearly forgotten about everything that had happened at his house, or at least I had pushed it far enough back in my mind that it didn't seem important anymore. The first night at the lake house, something felt off. I chalked it up to being in a different place, the way a new house can feel unfamiliar at night. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A shadow, just at the edge of my vision, disappearing as soon as I turned my head. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to bring it up, didn't want to acknowledge it again. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of voices in the living room. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, listening. The voices were low, just above a whisper. John must have heard them too, because I heard him get up and walk toward the door. I stayed put, waiting. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of heavy footsteps, pounding down the hallway, straight toward my room. I bolted out of bed, my heart slamming in my chest, but when I ran into the hall, there was no one there. John wasn't in the house. I found him outside, standing on the porch, pale and shaken. He had heard it too. We didn't sleep much after that. The rest of the weekend passed in uneasy silence, both of us pretending like we weren't waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did, but when I came back the next weekend, the house had changed. A picture of me had been ripped from the wall, thrown down the hall. The pillows from the couch had been stacked, one on top of the other, perfectly balanced in the center. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. I didn't feel scared, just tired. I never mentioned it to John. We stopped hanging out as much after that, and I never saw anything like that again. I had spent nearly a year on the road, my bicycle carrying me across landscapes most people only saw in pictures. I had pedaled through the Amazon in Ecuador, past trees so dense they swallowed the sunlight by midday. I had climbed the mountains of Peru, where the air thinned and every breath felt like drinking ice water. I had seen the world in a way most people never would, by feeling it under my tires, by sleeping in its dirt, by trusting my own endurance to carry me forward. Now, I was back in the US, 2 days away from home. 2 days. After everything I had been through, all the wild places I had camped, the nights spent alone in the middle of nowhere, I had finally made it back to familiar ground. My home state, the Arizona desert. I was tired. My body was worn down from the thousands of miles I had put on it, my skin darkened by months of sun and wind. I was still moving, still camping, but I had lost the sharpness I had in the beginning, the heightened awareness that had kept me alive in unfamiliar lands. There's something about being close to home that makes you drop your guard. You start thinking, I've made it. You start believing nothing bad will happen because the finish line is right there. That night, I found a spot just off the road, a few hundred feet from where the dirt turned to pavement. It was a good place, flat, quiet, surrounded by low shrubs and the towering arms of saguaro cacti. I set up my tent, stashed my food high in a cactus to keep it away from scavengers, and sat outside, playing my little travel guitar. The air was dry, warm even though the sun had long since set. The stars stretched overhead, more than I had seen in months, the desert sky wide and endless. I felt comfortable. That was my first mistake. When I finally crawled into my tent, my muscles ached with that familiar, satisfying exhaustion of a long day on the bike. I lay back, staring at the fabric above me, listening to the desert around me. There wasn't much to hear, just the wind moving through the cacti, the occasional rustling of a small animal in the brush. The kind of quiet that could lull you to sleep without you even realizing it. Then I heard it, a faint scampering, tiny footsteps on the packed earth, moving fast. They stopped. A few seconds later, they started again, this time closer to my tent. Stop, then closer. Stop. At first, I wasn't worried. It was probably a ringtail or a raccoon, something small, something curious. I had encountered plenty of animals on this trip, most of them harmless. I sat up, listening, waiting. When the sound came again, I unzipped the tent and leaned out, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was creeping toward me. Nothing. I flicked on my headlamp, scanning the ground. The light bounced off the dry dirt, the scattered rocks, the thin shadows cast by the cacti. But whatever had been there was gone. I shrugged it off and settled back into my sleeping bag. But a few minutes later, it came back. Scampering. Stop. Scampering. Stop. Closer this time. I tried again. Moved too fast. Whatever it was, it bolted before I could see it. Now I was curious. Not scared, not yet. Just curious. I decided to try something different. I unzipped the tent just enough to leave it open and position myself so I could see out without moving. Then I turned off my headlamp, resting my finger on the button, ready to turn it back on the second I heard the sound again. And I waited. The seconds stretched, then the minutes. My breathing slowed. My eyes adjusted to the dark. Then, just as I was starting to wonder if it had left, I heard it again. The tiny feet against the earth. Closer, closer. I pressed the button. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on two small eyes staring straight at me. I froze. The animal didn't move. Even then, I wasn't alarmed. I could tell by the eye shine that it was low to the ground, probably a raccoon or a fox. It wasn't big, and it wasn't acting aggressive. It was just staring. But then something changed. For some reason, I decided to turn my head slightly and shine the light to my left. Another pair of eyes. My stomach tightened. I swung the light to the right. Another pair. My pulse jumped. I scanned further to the right. More eyes. I turned, shining the light behind me over my tent. Two more, and then two more. I wasn't looking at a few small animals anymore. I was surrounded. My brain kicked into overdrive, trying to piece together what I was seeing. I counted at least 10 sets of eyes, maybe more, all of them low to the ground, all of them watching me without moving. I strained to make out their shapes, but the darkness swallowed everything except those glowing points of light. What the hell surrounds a tent like this? Coyotes. No, coyotes don't act like this. They don't move in perfect silence. They don't sit and watch like this. They don't surround things. Javelinas? Maybe. They could be aggressive if they felt threatened, but even that didn't make sense. I had never seen them behave this way. And why were they so quiet? I stayed perfectly still, gripping my headlamp so tight my fingers ached. The eyes didn't move. No sound, no shifting, no indication of what they were thinking. Just watching. I had no weapon. No way to defend myself if whatever these were decided to close in. The tent was nothing, just fabric, just a thin sheet between me and whatever was out there. I had to do something. My guitar was within reach. I grabbed it, my movements slow and deliberate, my eyes locked on the ones in front of me. I lifted it, took a deep breath, and strummed as hard as I could. The sound shattered the silence. The chords rang out across the desert, cutting through the stillness like a siren. For the first time, the eyes moved. Some blinked. Some turned away. I kept playing, louder, faster, not stopping for even a second. The desert was alive with sound now, my fingers hitting the strings with every ounce of force I had in me. And slowly, one by one, the eyes disappeared. I played until the first light of dawn touched the horizon, until my fingers were raw, until my arms ached from the constant motion. By the time the sun rose high enough to cast real light over the desert, they were gone. I stepped out of the tent, scanning the ground for tracks, for any sign of what had been there. Nothing. I packed up my gear without eating, without resting, my body still wired with adrenaline. When I got back on my bike, I pedaled harder than I had in months. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. 2 days later, I was home. I still don't know what was out there that night, but I know one thing. I wasn't alone. It was a late summer evening, one of those nights when the air still had the heat from the day, but there was just enough of a breeze to keep things cool. It was around 11 p.m., and my friend Kyle and I had been hanging out at his place, talking about nothing in particular. We were in that weird limbo between being bored and being a little too tired to head to bed, but not quite tired enough to sleep. Kyle lived on the outskirts of a small town near Calgary, and there was this undeveloped patch of land right behind his house. It wasn't much, just some old fields, a few random hills, and a stretch of woods that seemed to go on forever. People rarely went out there, and we figured it would be a good place to kill time. It was peaceful, but also a bit eerie. You couldn't shake the feeling that something was off out there, like it had a way of making your mind play tricks on you. Anyway, we'd been out there a few times before, sneaking through the long grass and wandering around the hills. We had a system for getting past the barbed wire fence that bordered the area. I was taller, so I'd lift my leg high and slip through the lower part of the fence, while Kyle crawled under the top wire. It was easy enough, and we'd made it a ritual of sorts. Every couple of nights, we'd meet up and do the same thing. Tonight was no different at first. We were just out to kill time, not expecting anything unusual. We made our way to the fence without much thought, the crickets and distant noises of the town buzzing quietly around us. There was an odd sort of quiet out there, even with the usual sounds of wildlife. It was the kind of quiet that felt too still, like the land itself was holding its breath. We got through the fence without a hitch, the metal wire creaking as it swayed behind us. From there, We made our way toward the big dirt hill we'd climbed a few times before. It wasn't too steep, just a gentle incline, but it gave a pretty decent view of the whole area. The hill wasn't far from the tree line, and as we climbed to the top, I could feel the cool air brushing against my skin, but there was a weird sense of tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. Kyle felt it too, judging by the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, but neither of us said anything. When we reached the top, I felt the usual rush that came from being so high up, looking out over the land below. The lights of the town were far off in the distance, and the stars above looked like they were scattered across a black canvas. For a second, everything felt normal, even peaceful. But then I saw something down below. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I squinted, trying to make out any shapes, but nothing seemed to add up. It was then that I saw it again, more clearly this time. A cluster of tents. They were big tents, not the small ones you'd expect to see on a campsite. These looked like they were meant for a lot of people, and they were set up in a way that seemed deliberate. There was no campfire, no sign of any other light, but the tents were there, huddled together in the middle of the land. It struck me as odd, but I didn't say anything to Kyle at first. "What the hell?" Kyle whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. He must have seen it too. I felt my heart rate pick up as I tried to figure out what to do. "We should stay low," I said, already sliding down the hill to get a better angle of the tents. We both dropped flat onto the dirt, keeping ourselves as hidden as possible. The tents were too far away to see any details, but the fact that they were set up there, out in the middle of nowhere, didn't sit right with me. We lay there in silence for a while, trying to make sense of what we were looking at. My thoughts kept drifting to the strange quietness around us, how everything felt too still, too unnatural. I tried to focus on the tents, but it was hard. Something about the whole situation didn't feel like it belonged. About 15 minutes passed before we heard movement. It was faint at first, just the sound of boots crunching against the dirt. Then, we saw a figure emerge from one of the tents. A man. He was tall, disheveled, with a ginger beard and a rough-looking face that made him look like he hadn't seen civilization in weeks. He wore tattered clothes, but it was the way he moved that caught my attention. His gait was uneven, like he wasn't really paying attention to where he was going. Then, he did something that I'll never forget. He unzipped his pants and began to piss on the ground, right in front of the tent. The whole thing was so weird, so random, that I couldn't even process it at first. Kyle nudged me, and I snapped out of my trance. "We have to get out of here," he whispered harshly. I didn't argue. The guy was close enough that if he saw us, we'd be in serious trouble. I could already imagine the worst-case scenario in my head, getting caught by some group of people living out there. Who knows who they were or what they were doing? I knew the risks of being out there, but this was something else. The guy looked like a hobo, but he wasn't alone. Who else was with him? Before I could make a move, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance, low and steady, coming from the direction of the tents. My stomach dropped when I saw the bright beam of a spotlight cutting through the dark. A golf cart, of all things, with a massive light on the front, moving slowly toward the tents. "Shit," Kyle muttered, pulling me lower into the dirt. We had to keep still. We couldn't be seen. If they saw us now, we were dead meat. I held my breath, praying that the light wouldn't shine our way. We watched as the cart moved past the tents, the light sweeping across the area. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before the cart moved on, leaving us in the dark once again. I exhaled sharply. "We need to go. Now." We didn't waste any time. We scrambled down the hill, making sure to keep low as we went. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. We didn't speak, just ran. I could hear the sound of Kyle's footsteps behind me, heavy and quick. But as we neared the fence, I heard something that froze me in place. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I whipped around, and for a split second, I saw one of the men, the one from the golf cart, standing at the top of the hill, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. The spotlight had turned back in our direction, and I knew we'd been spotted. The guy yelled something else, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned and bolted straight for the fence. I was so close I could almost taste the relief of getting out of there, but as I reached the fence, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind me. "Run!" Kyle shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. We both scrambled through the fence as fast as we could, our hands scraping against the wire as we squeezed through. I could hear the guy still shouting, getting closer. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, feeling the tension in my body as we sprinted across the field. We didn't stop until we were at Kyle's house, slamming the door behind us and locking it. We both collapsed onto the floor, breathing hard, our bodies trembling with adrenaline. We didn't say anything for a while, just sat there in the silence, listening to the sound of our own breathing. I don't think I've ever been that scared in my life. I kept thinking about the tents, about the weird group of people out there. What were they doing? Who were they? And why the hell were they so far out in the middle of nowhere? I don't know if we'll ever find out, but I'm not going back out there to try. After that night, we didn't talk much about what happened. But it was always there, in the back of my mind, whenever I'd walk past the old dirt hill or the barbed wire fence. I don't think I'll ever forget the look in that guy's eyes as he yelled at us, or the sound of his voice as he ran after us. It felt real, too real. But we made it out, and that's all that matters. We never went back to that hill again. I was about 3 or 4 when it happened. Back then, I slept in a small bedroom right off the kitchen, a narrow little space that felt tucked away from the rest of the house. At that age, my world was small, my bed, my toys, the dresser against the wall, the doorway that led out into the warm light of the kitchen. My mom would still be awake most nights after I went to bed, doing whatever moms do in the kitchen, washing dishes, packing lunches, moving around in a way that was familiar and comforting. I could always hear her, the soft clinking of plates, the shuffle of her footsteps against the floor. There wasn't much in my room, just the essentials, a bed, a dresser, a couple of toys, and the doll. That porcelain doll my aunt had given me. I don't know why she thought I would like it. Maybe she thought all little kids liked dolls. It had a stand, one of those black plastic ones with a thin metal rod that wrapped around its waist, keeping it propped up straight. Its dress was a pale pink color, stiff and lacy, like something that belonged to another time. Its face was painted with delicate little features, too perfect to be real. Tiny red lips, round glass eyes that always seemed just a little too glossy, a little too deep. It wasn't the kind of doll you played with. It just sat there, up on the dresser, to the left of my bedroom door, watching. I don't know if I had woken up in the middle of the night, or if I had never fallen asleep at all. The room was dim, only the faintest bit of light coming from the kitchen. My door wasn't completely closed, so I could see the glow from under it, the shifting of shadows when my mom moved around out there. I was curled up in bed, small and still, staring toward the doorway, waiting for sleep that wasn't coming. Then my eyes drifted toward the dresser. The doll was standing there, exactly where it always was, its hands in their usual position, its painted expression frozen in place. But something felt wrong. The longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. Then it moved. It wasn't a big movement. Not at first. Just the slightest twitch of its fingers, the barely there shift of its tiny porcelain hand. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and my body tensed up, every instinct in me telling me to look away, to roll over, to bury my face in my blanket and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I was locked in place, watching, waiting, unable to move or breathe or think. Then, as if it had been waiting for me to notice, it raised its arm. The movement was slow, deliberate. Not stiff, not jerky, not like a toy that had fallen or slipped or been nudged by something unseen. It lifted its tiny, delicate hand all the way up to its mouth and pressed a single painted finger against its lips. Shuh. That was when I lost it. I didn't know how to speak much yet, not in full sentences, not in a way that made sense, but I could cry. And I did. I screamed as loud as I could, tears hot and fast down my face, my little body shaking so hard I could barely sit up. I was too scared to run, too scared to move at all. The moment my mom's footsteps came rushing toward the door, the doll moved again. Just as slow, just as deliberate. It lowered its hand, settled itself back into place, tilted slightly on its stand as if nothing had ever happened. By the time my mom pushed the door open, I was still crying, still shaking, pointing frantically at the dresser. But when she looked, when she flicked on the light and scanned the room, there was nothing to see. Just my bed, my dresser, my toys. The doll, perfectly still. I don't remember if I had the words to explain what I had seen. I don't know if I even tried. I only remember the way I felt, the way my chest ached from how hard I had been crying, the way my mom picked me up and held me for a long time before tucking me back into bed, the way I refused to look toward the dresser again, refused to let my eyes drift in that direction even after the lights were turned off and the door was left cracked open just a little more than before. The next day, I refused to sleep in that room unless the doll was gone. I remember my mom being confused, but not arguing. She picked it up, carried it out, put it somewhere else in the house. Somewhere I wouldn't have to see it. For a long time, I told myself it must have been a dream, that I had been half asleep, my young mind blurring reality with something imagined. It made sense. It was easier to believe that. But when I brought it up to my mom years later, she said she remembered. Not the doll moving, not the details I had never told her, but she remembered how scared I had been, how I wouldn't stop crying until she took the doll away. She had never understood why, but I did, and I've never trusted dolls since. The summer of '97 was one of those hot, dry years, the kind where you could practically feel the air crackling with heat, and the grass seemed to bend and wither under the weight of the sun. Fires weren't unusual around our town, but that summer they were different. The smoke seemed to hang in the air longer, thicker, and the smell of burning would seep into every crevice, every moment. Every day, the news would report another fire on the outskirts of town, getting closer and closer to homes. It felt like the whole place was on edge, like we were all just waiting for the inevitable. At first, the fires seemed accidental, maybe caused by careless campers or a lightning strike. But it didn't take long before people started whispering. Something wasn't right. The fires were too precise, too calculated. They weren't happening randomly. They were spreading intentionally, one after another, keeping the small fire department hopping with no time to breathe. It became clear that someone was doing it on purpose. I remember watching the news that summer when they mentioned that an older fireman had gone missing. I didn't know him personally, but I recognized his face. He was a fixture in the community, someone who had served the town for decades. He had always been there when things went wrong, putting out fires, helping people, and making sure everyone was safe. His name was Bill Rogers, and when I heard he was missing, I knew it wasn't good. The fires kept burning, and soon enough, the town was on edge. We started to hear more rumors about Bill. Some said he'd been caught in one of the fires, unable to make it out in time. Others whispered that he'd run off, maybe scared or confused, but nothing made sense. There were no answers. And then months passed. I was hanging out with my friend Tyler one winter afternoon when something happened that would change everything. Tyler was one of those guys who had no real fear, the kind of person who'd jump into an icy lake for a laugh. He'd been out on his snowmobile that day, riding across the fields behind his house. It had been one of those crisp days where everything looked like it was covered in a thick layer of frost, the snow sparkling in the sun like a blanket of diamonds. Tyler had a route he liked to take, a loop through the fields, over the frozen creek, and around the edges of the woods. I knew this area well, and it wasn't unusual for him to be out there alone. But this time was different. Tyler said he had lost traction on the snowmobile, spinning out on some slick ice. He stopped, trying to get the machine back on track. When he investigated the snowmobile, he noticed something strange caught in the treads. A piece of cloth. At first, he figured it was just some ragged fabric, maybe from an old fence or something he'd passed earlier. But when he took a closer look, he realized it was something more. He got off the snowmobile and started to walk back, tracing his tracks in the snow to where he'd spun out. The cloth had been dragged along, and as he followed the trail, he started to notice something else. A shape. A body. Tyler froze when he saw it. His heart nearly stopped in his chest. The body was face down in the snow, a cold, frozen lump. He didn't want to believe it, but there was no mistaking it. He recognized the coat. It was Bill Rogers, the missing fireman. His first instinct was to get the hell out of there. He didn't know what he was looking at, and he sure as hell didn't want to be the one to find it. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the feeling that if he left, no one would know where the body was. No one would find Bill in time. So against every nerve in his body, he decided to do the right thing. He ran back to his house and called the police. It felt like it took forever for the officers to arrive, though Tyler knew it was only a matter of minutes. He didn't even wait for them to get there. He turned back to the field, back to the body, and sat beside it, watching the snow fall gently around him. He couldn't explain why he stayed. Maybe he just didn't want someone else to stumble across Bill's body the way he had. Maybe it was out of respect for the man who had spent his life helping others. But sitting there with the dead fireman, in that quiet, frozen field, Tyler felt something change in him. When the police finally showed up, they immediately took charge. They sealed off the area, took photos, and started their investigation. But there wasn't much for them to do at first. Bill Rogers had been shot, right in the chest. The wounds were clean, deliberate. The shotgun blast had taken him down instantly. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign that Bill had even tried to fight back. Whoever had done this had known exactly what they were doing. Tyler told them everything he knew, but there wasn't much to say. He hadn't seen anyone else. He hadn't heard any shots. It was as though the body had been placed there after the fact, like the killer had wanted it to be found, but only after they were sure the fireman had been dispatched alone to fight yet another fire. It made sense when they started piecing things together. Bill had always been the one to go alone. The fires had been set deliberately, hoping that the older fireman would be the one to answer the call, alone, unprepared. The investigation unraveled quickly after that. It turned out that the person behind the fires wasn't some careless arsonist, or even someone looking for attention. No, this person was mentally disturbed. They had a specific vendetta against Bill Rogers, and they had been setting the fires in a twisted hope that the fireman would be the one sent to the scene alone. When Bill arrived to fight the flames, the killer had been waiting. They shot him, then dragged his body into the field, leaving it for Tyler to find. The news spread like wildfire through the town. The whole community was in shock. Bill Rogers, a man who had given so much of his life to the town, had been murdered. And for what? A sick, twisted plan? No one could believe it. But Tyler was different after that. He didn't talk about it much, but I could see it in his eyes. The carefreeness that he used to have, the willingness to go out into the fields and just have fun was gone. It was like something inside him had snapped. I don't think he was ever the same after finding Bill's body, sitting with it in the snow, waiting for the police. He was quieter, more distant. He stopped spending time alone in the fields, stopped taking the snowmobile out at night. It wasn't that he was scared, but you could see the weight of what he had found and the burden it had put on him. He would never talk about it in detail. Not to me, not to anyone. But there was a shift in him, a loss of innocence. He understood the darkness that could exist in the world in a way none of us could. We all had that one moment, that one experience that changed us forever. And for Tyler, it had been finding Bill Rogers in the snow. The investigation dragged on for months, and eventually, the arsonist was caught. But by then, the damage had already been done. The killer, as it turned out, had been someone who lived in the town, someone who had watched Bill Rogers for years, waiting for the right moment. The police didn't have to search far for the man who had done it. But even after his capture, the town was never the same. And Tyler? Well, he moved on. Eventually. But he was never the same. None of us were. I don't think anyone could ever truly move on from something like that. Not after seeing the darkness lurking just beneath the surface. I can still see it in his eyes when I think about it. The way it changed him. Tyler wasn't the same person after that winter day. And neither were we. I had always thought of myself as careful, at least careful enough. I was 21, had tried online dating, had met plenty of people in different situations, and had never really had a bad experience. Sure, there had been boring dates, awkward hookups, and a handful of guys who had been a little too eager, but nothing that had ever made me feel unsafe. I had gotten comfortable, maybe too comfortable. That's the thing about nothing bad happening for a while. You start to think it never will. That night, I had been on a date. It had been forgettable, a dull conversation over dinner that never really went anywhere. As I was heading home, I started messaging someone else, a guy I had been talking to on and off, but hadn't met yet. When I told him about my uneventful night, he suggested we do something spontaneous. A late-night drive around the city, just to talk and see the sights. I was still fairly new to the area and didn't know my way around too well, so the idea of exploring a bit sounded nice. It wasn't a big deal, I thought. I had done it before. We agreed to meet outside a pub near my house, a spot that was well lit and had people around. When I got there, he was already waiting in his car, an older beat-up sedan that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. Fast food wrappers and empty bottles cluttered the passenger side floor, and the faint smell of something stale lingered in the air. He wasn't exactly what I had expected from his pictures, a little rougher around the edges, a little more bogan than I had imagined, but he seemed friendly enough. I got in the car. At first, it was fine. We drove through the city, passing the familiar streets I had started to recognize. The conversation was easy enough, nothing special, but it kept the drive from feeling awkward. But then we started heading further out. At first, I didn't think much of it. He mentioned needing to get gas, said he knew a place a little outside the city where it was cheaper. It wasn't unreasonable, gas was expensive, and I wasn't exactly rich either. But as we kept driving, I started to realize we were going a lot farther than I had expected. We passed the outer neighborhoods, the last tram stops, then the end of the train line. The buildings thinned out, replaced by empty stretches of road and scattered trees. I checked my phone. 1:30 a.m. Battery at 17%. It was only then that he decided to tell me he wasn't actually allowed to drive. He had lost his license because of a DUI, had been avoiding court for 2 years, and was technically supposed to be in custody if the cops found him behind the wheel. He had all the paperwork in the car, which he proudly showed me as if it were some kind of achievement. He even mentioned how he usually never drove unless he was high, like this was all just a normal part of his life. I wanted to get out of the car. Now, I told him to take me home. He just said, "We're almost there." Then he turned off the highway and started driving up a hill. The fog started rolling in as we climbed. At first, it was light, just a mist hanging low over the road, but the higher we went, the thicker it became. Soon, I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of the car. The headlights barely cut through it, casting a weak, yellowish glow into the dense white around us. The trees lining the road turned into dark, shadowy figures that loomed on either side, barely visible through the haze. I told him again I wanted to go home. He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled over. I thought for a moment that he was finally listening, but then he put the car in park and leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. He called it a revive recovery brake. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I didn't want to be sitting in the passenger seat of a car, parked on the side of a desolate, fog-covered road at nearly 2 in the morning with a guy who had just admitted he shouldn't even be driving. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had already sent a message to a friend, telling them where I was, who I was with, his name, his number, even a description of his car. My phone was dying, but at least someone knew. At least I wasn't completely alone in this. I told him he had 10 minutes before I called the cops. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves outside, the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. The car was still running, the soft hum of the engine, the only real noise. I kept my hand on my phone. The minutes crawled by. Then, finally, he sighed and started the car again. The drive back felt longer. The fog didn't let up, and the winding roads made it impossible to see what was ahead. I stayed tense the whole way, watching the road, my mind racing through every possible scenario. What if he changed his mind? What if he decided he didn't want to take me back? But he did. We reached the city again, the familiar lights breaking through the fog, the streets coming back into focus. My apartment was close now, just a few more turns. When he finally pulled up near my building, I didn't wait. I got out before he could say anything, shutting the door behind me and walking straight inside without looking back. I locked the door. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I sat down on the floor of my apartment, my hands still shaking. The whole thing felt unreal, like I had just walked away from something that could have gone so much worse. I never saw him again. I never got in a stranger's car again. I never thought much about how fragile the sense of safety was until that year in college. The dorms weren't particularly nice, just your standard cinder block walls, stained carpet, and the occasional smell of burnt ramen drifting through the halls. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and if someone so much as dropped their phone upstairs, you'd hear the thud below. Privacy wasn't really a thing. Everyone was in everyone else's business, but for the most part, it was harmless. Stupid dorm pranks, people sneaking off to smoke outside, the usual. I lived on the 3rd floor with my 2 roommates. The floor above us, the 4th, was just as packed with students, but I rarely interacted with anyone from up there. That changed the day we met him. It started off normal. Me and my roommates were being loud, probably too loud. We had a bad habit of blasting music, laughing, and being overall disruptive without really thinking about it. It was just another one of those afternoons where we were screwing around, music playing, voices raised, completely unaware that anything was about to change. I don't remember the exact moment he walked in. It was one of those things that didn't seem important at the time. He had just kind of wandered onto our floor. Our door was open, as it usually was, and without any real hesitation, he stepped inside like he had always belonged there. He wasn't what I expected. If you had told me back then that someone on the fourth floor was dangerous, I would have imagined a big, intimidating guy with a temper, someone who picked fights. But he wasn't like that. He was tall and lanky, the kind of person who moved a little too fast or a little too slow, like he wasn't entirely comfortable in his own body. His face was expressionless most of the time, except for his eyes, which always seemed too alert, too focused. The first thing I noticed was how he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It never reached his eyes. It just sat there on his face, stretched too wide or not wide enough, like he was mimicking something he had seen other people do. At first, we thought he was just another weird dorm kid. Colleges were full of them. People who didn't quite fit in, but weren't necessarily dangerous. He made some odd comments here and there, but nothing that immediately set off alarms. A little awkward, maybe, but nothing we hadn't seen before. He started hanging around more. At first, it was kind of funny. He was just odd. He'd show up, linger, sit on the edge of a conversation like he was waiting for an opportunity to be included. He had this way of inserting himself into things without actually being invited. I remember thinking that he was just lonely. He seemed like someone who had always been on the outside looking in, and for a little while, I didn't mind. Then he started gravitating toward me. It wasn't subtle. At first, it was just the occasional comment that seemed directed more at me than at anyone else. Then it became more persistent. He'd ask what I was doing, where I was going, if I wanted to hang out. He took a particular interest in a small group of us who had just started smoking weed, showing up whenever we were planning to go out and light up. At first, I didn't mind too much. He was weird, yeah, but harmless. At least, that's what I thought. The more time I spent around him, though, the more unsettling he became. There was something about the way he talked, the way his words lingered a little too long on certain subjects. His humor was off. When he laughed, it was always just a half second too late, like he had to process when it was appropriate to react. One night, we all got high together, and I remember sitting there, trying to focus on anything but him, because the way he talked was making my skin crawl. He had this way of telling stories that were just a little too personal, a little too raw, like he didn't understand what things were supposed to be kept private. He talked about pain a lot. Not his own pain, other people's. It wasn't in an obvious way, not at first. He'd mention things in passing, things about how interesting it was that people could be pushed to their limits, how the body reacted to certain kinds of stress. It was casual, like he was talking about the weather. But the more I heard, the more it became clear that he wasn't just interested in pain. He was fascinated by it. That was the last time I willingly hung out with him. I made the decision then and there that I wasn't going to be around him anymore. But I didn't know how to tell him that. I wasn't good at confrontation, and he wasn't the kind of person you could just ghost without consequences. So instead, I started avoiding him. Not subtly either. If I saw him coming, I'd turn the other way. If he texted, I wouldn't respond. If he knocked on our door, I'd pretend I wasn't there. At first, it seemed to work, but then he figured it out. He didn't get mad at the group, just me. I could feel it before he even said anything. The way he looked at me changed. He stopped smiling, even that weird, too stiff smile he used to wear. He started watching me in a way that made my stomach knot up. If I passed him in the hallway, he wouldn't speak, but his eyes would follow me until I was out of sight. I told myself I was imagining it. Then came the day I walked into my room and saw him sitting there, talking to my roommate and a couple of other friends. I froze in the doorway. He turned to look at me, and that's when I saw it, that odd little smirk he sometimes had, the one that made my chest feel tight. The room was too quiet, too tense. Then, without warning, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Yeah, I'm a sadist, so if I ever killed anyone, I'd torture them first." Silence. I remember making eye contact with my roommate, then one of my friends. We were all thinking the same thing. What the hell did he just say? I don't remember how long the silence lasted, but I do remember that no one laughed. No one tried to brush it off. We just sat there, frozen, waiting for someone else to say something, to break whatever spell had settled over the room. I reported it to the RA. So did my roommate. Nothing happened. They brushed it off, told us he was probably just joking, that he hadn't made any threats. That was when I realized no one was going to do anything. And to make things worse, my roommates refused to close our door at night. It was too hot, they said. We needed the airflow. I barely slept for weeks. Every sound outside the door made my heart pound. Every creak of the floor, every distant voice, every whisper of movement in the hall. I started sleeping with something heavy near my bed, something I could grab if I needed to. Then, one day, he was just gone. No warning, no explanation. People noticed, but no one knew what happened. Some said he dropped out. Others said he transferred. There were rumors, of course. Someone claimed he got arrested. Someone else swore they saw him packing up in the middle of the night. But no one really knew. All I knew was that I slept better after that. But even now, years later, I still wonder what happened to him. And I still remember the way he looked at me. It was 2002, back when I was in my undergrad. I was staying in a co-ed dorm, one of those old buildings that had seen generations of students come and go. The floors were linoleum, worn down by years of foot traffic, and the walls had layers of paint over old drywall, making them feel just a little too thin. The rooms were small, just big enough for a bed, a desk, and a wardrobe, with barely any space left over. The lighting had that dim yellow tint that made everything feel just a little too tired. It wasn't exactly home, but after a while, you got used to it. I spent a lot of my time in my girlfriend's room. Her room was up on the 6th floor, while mine was all the way down on the 2nd, at the end of a long hallway that always seemed darker than the rest of the building. I hated going back there late at night. The air always felt colder down that hallway, and the flickering light near my door didn't help. I told myself it was just the old wiring in the building, but still, I avoided it when I could. That night, the night before one of my final exams, I had been studying in my girlfriend's room for hours. She had fallen asleep around 2 a.m., curling up in her bed under a pile of soft toys, leaving me alone with my textbooks. I was exhausted, but I pushed through, scribbling notes and trying to cram as much information into my head as possible. I had no idea how much time had passed until I finally looked at the clock and saw that it was just past 4 a.m. I closed my books and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders from sitting hunched over for so long. My eyes burned, and my brain felt sluggish. The last thing I wanted to do was pack up all my books and walk 4 floors down to my room. I knew that by the time I got down there, I'd be too tired to bother getting into bed properly. Instead, I figured I'd just crash right there on her floor. Her bed was covered in stuffed animals, barely leaving enough space for her, let alone me. I wasn't about to move all of them and risk waking her up, so I grabbed my sleeping bag from the corner where I'd left it and spread it out on the floor. The dorm floors weren't the most comfortable, but at that point, I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. I lay down on my back, facing her bed. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I could see her face, her breathing slow and steady, completely lost in sleep. I closed my eyes, trying to let my body relax, but my mind wouldn't shut off. The stress of the exam was still lingering. I thought about the questions that might come up, the parts one hadn't studied enough, whether I should have spent more time on certain topics. My brain kept looping through everything I'd just read, and I knew it would be a while before I actually fell asleep. Then, out of nowhere, she moved. I opened my eyes, thinking maybe she was just rolling over in her sleep. But that wasn't what happened. She didn't just move. She sat up, not slowly, not groggily, but in one sharp, unnatural motion, as if something had yanked her upright. Her torso shot up at a perfect 90-degree angle, her legs still flat on the bed. Her arms were spread wide at her sides, almost like she was being held up by something unseen. It was the kind of movement that didn't look natural, the kind you'd expect from a marionette, not a sleeping person. I froze. Her head was tilted back slightly, and her eyes. I couldn't tell if they were open or closed. The dim light made it hard to see. But her mouth moved, and something came out. It wasn't words. At least, not any words I could understand. The sound was low at first, almost like a mumble, but then it grew louder. It had a rhythm to it like a chant, but the language, if it even was a language, was completely unfamiliar. I had never heard anything like it before. It wasn't slurred like sleep talk, and it wasn't random gibberish. It felt structured, like something with meaning, something deliberate. My body tensed, every muscle locked in place. I wanted to move, to say something, but I couldn't. I just lay there, watching, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound only lasted a few seconds. Then, just as suddenly as she had sat up, she fell back. Not slowly, not like someone drifting back to sleep, but like she had been dropped. Silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just lay there, staring at her, waiting for something else to happen. But she didn't move again. Her breathing stayed steady, completely normal, like nothing had happened at all. For a long time, I didn't do anything. I just kept staring, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Sleep talking, sleep paralysis, some kind of seizure, but nothing seemed to fit. Eventually, my body reminded me how exhausted I was. My muscles ached from the tension, and my head throbbed from lack of sleep. I told myself it didn't matter. Whatever it was over now. She was still breathing normally. She was fine. I forced myself to close my eyes. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise in the room made me jolt awake, and every time I opened my eyes, I half expected to see her sitting up again. But she never did. When morning finally came, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting long streaks of light across the room. My girlfriend stirred, stretching and yawning before rolling onto her side. I watched her for a few minutes, waiting for her to say something, to mention something about a weird dream or a bad night's sleep. But she didn't. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up, rubbing my face, and asked her if she had slept okay. She gave me a weird look and said, "Yeah, why?" I hesitated. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen without sounding crazy. So I just shook my head and said, "No reason." She never had an episode like that again. At least, not that I ever saw. We stayed together for a while after that, but we never talked about that night. I never told her what I had seen, but I know what I saw. Even now, years later, I can still picture it perfectly. The way she moved, the way her voice sounded, the eerie stillness that followed. I'll never know what it was. Maybe there's a logical explanation. Maybe it was just some strange, one-time sleep event that I happened to witness. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that, for those few seconds, she wasn't really there. I've never really believed in the paranormal. I wasn't the type to get scared by ghost stories, and I always thought people who claimed to see things were just jumping to conclusions. But looking back, these two moments in my life are the ones I can't explain. I try to be logical about things. I try to think through what's reasonable, what makes sense. But no matter how many times I go over it in my head, I don't have an answer. And even though I don't like to think about it, I can't forget it either. The first time it happened, I was 14. Our house wasn't anything fancy, just a normal two-story place, a little old but not creepy or anything. My parents' bedroom was right across from mine at the top of the stairs. If I stepped out of my room, I could see straight into theirs. The stairs were to the right, leading down to the ground floor, which was mostly open, a living room at the bottom of the stairs, the dining room beyond that, and then the kitchen. If you turned left from the stairs, you'd find a short hallway leading to the bathroom. We always kept a dim light on downstairs at night, just bright enough so if someone needed to get up, they wouldn't have to fumble around in the dark. That night, I woke up at 3 in the morning. I didn't check the time, but I knew it had to be late just from the silence. I had to pee, and I didn't think much of it as I rolled out of bed and shuffled towards the stairs. The house felt cold, the way houses do at night when the heater isn't running. I was groggy, not really paying attention to anything, just making my way down carefully so I wouldn't miss a step in the dim light. At the bottom of the stairs, I turned left toward the bathroom. That's when I saw it. The front door of our house was glass. Not fully, but the main panel had a large glass window in the center, and at night, it acted like a mirror. The light from inside reflected off it, showing a faint, hazy image of whatever was behind me. And as I stepped forward, I caught sight of something moving in the reflection. It was my dad, or at least I thought it was. He was stepping out of the bathroom, right where I was headed. It made sense. He sometimes got up in the middle of the night, and I knew from experience that he wasn't the kind of person you wanted to bother when he was still half asleep. He was grumpy in the mornings, always slow-moving, barely aware of anything until he was fully awake. And since the hallway was narrow, I figured I'd just wait for him to walk past before going in myself. I wasn't in a hurry. I sat down on the bottom step, yawning, rubbing my eyes. I kept them half closed, not really thinking about anything, just waiting for him to pass. But he didn't. I sat there for a few seconds, then a few more, and something felt off. He should have walked past me already, heading back to the couch where he usually slept. but the living room was silent. I blinked, suddenly a little more awake. Then I heard it. A snore. It came from the couch. Slow, deep, steady. I turned my head. My dad was there, stretched out on his side, dead asleep. I felt my stomach drop. I had just seen him walk out of the bathroom. I knew I had. I wasn't imagining it. I had been awake enough to recognize the way he moved, the way he held himself. I had sat down specifically to wait for him to pass. But now he was there, on the couch, and he hadn't moved at all. For a few seconds, I didn't breathe. Then, without thinking, I scrambled back up the stairs as fast as I could, my heartbeat hammering so hard I felt it in my throat. I barely even felt my feet touch the steps. I reached my bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it. I stood there in the dark, hands shaking. I had to pee, but I wasn't going back down there. No way. I stayed awake for a long time listening. Nothing else happened. The next morning, I told my parents. My mom laughed it off, said I was dreaming. My dad didn't even remember waking up. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was half asleep, and my brain had filled in the blanks. I tried to convince myself that was true, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been awake enough to know what I saw. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things. Sounds at night, strange creaks, faint noises I couldn't quite place. Sometimes, I'd be in my room and hear what sounded like someone moving downstairs, only to find nothing when I went to check. I ignored it. I told myself it was just the house settling, the way old houses do. I let it go, until it happened again. This time, I was 15. It was early evening, about 8 p.m., and my dad was working late. My mom was upstairs cleaning, running the vacuum. I was in the living room, sitting at the family computer. I had over-the-ear headphones on, but I never liked wearing both at full volume. I always kept one ear uncovered, so I could hear what was going on around me. I didn't like feeling completely cut off from my surroundings, especially when I was home alone. The computer screen was bright, the only real source of light in the dim room. I was watching YouTube, scrolling through whatever random videos I had queued up. Then I noticed it. A shadow. It passed over the screen, quick but solid. A shape moving behind me, blocking the light from the ceiling. I knew what it was before I even turned around. My mom did this all the time. She had a habit of sneaking up behind me while I was on the computer, leaning over my shoulder just to see what I was doing, just to annoy me. I sighed, reaching up to pull my headphones off. What? I turned. No one was there. The living room was empty. I sat there frozen. My brain couldn't process it at first. I had heard the sound of someone walking up behind me. The faint rustle of jeans brushing against carpet, the weight of a person moving. I had seen the shadow. I had felt the presence of someone standing close. And yet nothing. I swallowed hard. Then, from upstairs, my mom's voice. She was still up there. I stood up so fast my chair almost fell over. I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my chest tight, my hands shaking. My mom was in her room, looking down at the vacuum cleaner. She frowned at me. What's wrong? I couldn't answer at first. I was breathing too fast, my body still on edge. Then she pointed to the vacuum. The belt snapped. The room smelled like burning rubber. She hadn't turned it off. It had broken. And at the exact second it had stopped, I had felt someone standing behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I don't like to talk about these things. Even writing it down makes me feel uneasy, like I shouldn't be thinking about it. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that some things don't have explanations. I still don't believe in ghosts. But I don't know what else to believe. There was a strange, lingering scent of damp within the cabin, the kind that soaked into the walls and stuck to the air long after the rain had stopped. It had been hot during the day, but now, as night settled in, a cool breeze pushed through the cracks in the window frames. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of our restless movements. The bunk beds groaned as we shifted around, trying to find a comfortable way to settle in. Our grade 8 class had been at the camp for a few days now, and at this point, the nights had settled into a predictable routine. We'd spend the day hiking, swimming, or taking part in whatever outdoor activity the counselors had set up. Then at night, we'd sit around a bonfire while they told stories. Most of them were meant to scare us, tales about people who had vanished in the woods, strange noises heard near the cabins, or things seen in the lake late at night. None of them ever felt real, though. They were just stories. After the bonfire, we'd go back to our cabins and pretend to sleep for a while, but once the counselors finished their rounds, we'd usually start whispering, tossing snacks back and forth, and sometimes sneaking out if we thought we could get away with it. Someone always kept watch by the window, just in case a counselor decided to check in. That night, we were in the middle of one of those routine checks when one of the guys at the front window stiffened. I didn't notice at first. I was lying in my bunk, eyes half closed, letting my thoughts drift. But then someone whispered, sharp and low, "Dude, what the hell?" There was something about the way they said it that pulled me completely awake. The others shuffled closer, pressing up against the window. "What is it?" someone else muttered. I sat up. There was a pause, then someone said, "There's a guy out there." That got my attention. I climbed off the bunk and moved toward the front window. By the time I got there, I could already feel the tension in the air, the kind that made your chest feel tight even when nothing had happened yet. I leaned in, pushing my forehead close to the glass. The night outside was dark, the kind of deep black you only get in the middle of nowhere. The campground stretched beyond the cabin, scattered with patches of dirt and grass, an open area leading toward the woods. And sitting there, on top of a stack of wooden pallets, was an old man. He was hunched slightly, his back curved like he had been sitting there for a long time. Even from this distance, I could see that his clothes were worn, like he had been out in the elements for days. His hands rested on his knees, his head tilted downward. He wasn't moving. I don't know how long we stared at him, but none of us spoke. We weren't sure if he could see us, but we didn't want to take any chances. If he was some kind of staff member or local, we didn't want to get in trouble. If he wasn't, well, none of us wanted to think about that. Someone let out a slow breath. That's creepy as hell. Nobody argued. Eventually, we backed away from the window, our voices hushed. We weren't as loud after that. There was something unsettling about knowing that someone was out there, just sitting and watching the camp. But after 10 minutes, curiosity won over. "Check again," someone whispered. One of the guys crept toward the window and pulled back the blind. He stared for a second, then frowned. "He's gone." A few of us shuffled back to look. The pallets were still there, stacked unevenly against the ground, but the old man was gone. The night stretched out, empty, undisturbed. There was no sign of movement, no noise, nothing to show that someone had been there at all. A chill ran through me. Maybe he went to another cabin, someone offered, but it didn't feel right. There had been something so still about him, something unsettling about the way he had just been sitting there, not moving. "Everyone check your windows," one of the guys whispered. It was my turn to check the back window. I moved slowly toward it, my fingers gripping the edge of the blind. My breath felt too loud in my ears. I hesitated, just for a second, before pulling the blind back. And he was there, right outside the window. His face was level with mine. I sucked in a breath, body locking up completely. The window was high, at least 10, maybe 15 feet up, but he was standing there, his face pressed close to the glass, staring straight at me. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. His lips were cracked, and his expression was completely blank. My stomach twisted, a deep, primal kind of fear settling in. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then his lips twitched. Not a smile, not exactly. Just the smallest shift, like he was acknowledging that I had seen him. I dropped the blind so fast that it snapped against the glass. My breath came out in short, sharp gasps. "What?" someone whispered. "He's at the back," I choked out. The room went dead silent. No one checked the window again. We just climbed into our bunks and pulled our blankets over ourselves, curling into tight, silent shapes. No one whispered. No one laughed. We just lay there, bodies stiff, listening for anything outside the cabin. But we never heard him move. The second time I felt that kind of fear was at my great-grandmother's visitation. The funeral home smelled like flowers and stale air. The kind of scent that lingered in your throat, heavy and thick. The overhead lights cast everything in a soft, warm glow, but it didn't make the place feel any less lifeless. I had been sitting in the corner, half listening to my family talk in hushed voices, when the power went out. The room was swallowed in darkness. For a second, nobody moved. Then someone muttered a curse, and the sound of shuffling feet filled the space. There was nothing inherently scary about a power outage. But in that moment, sitting in the pitch-black silence of a funeral home, it felt like something was wrong. The kind of wrong that made the air feel heavy, the kind that made your stomach knot up for no real reason. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, yellowish glow. It wasn't much, just enough to barely see the outline of the room. The casket was still there, front and center. But in the low, flickering light, for just a second, it didn't look like it was empty. I stared at it, heart pounding, but then the lights flickered again, and everything looked normal. I told myself it was nothing, but I didn't sleep well that night. I went to the Chengdu Panda Park this summer while I was in China. It wasn't part of the plan, just something we fit in because we had some extra time. My parents had a meeting with some government guy, something about business, and I didn't really care. My tour guide, a young woman in her 20s, suggested we check out the panda park while we waited for them to finish up. I had no objections. It wasn't every day that I got to be in China, and I wasn't about to sit around doing nothing. The Chengdu Panda Park was basically a zoo, but instead of having all kinds of animals, it was just pandas. Giant pandas, red pandas, pandas sleeping, pandas eating, pandas climbing trees. If you like pandas, this was the place to be. The park was big, with well-maintained walking paths winding through different enclosures. Some areas were crowded with tourists, snapping pictures and pushing against railings to get a good view, while other parts were quieter, more spread out. It was the kind of place where you could just wander and enjoy the day. It was hot. China in the summer wasn't just warm. It was humid, the kind of heat that made your clothes stick to your skin and left you feeling sticky and uncomfortable. A lot of people carried umbrellas, not for rain, but to block out the sun. My guide had one, a light blue one that she popped open as soon as we stepped out of the car. I didn't bother. I didn't really care if I got a little sunburned. At first, it was a normal visit. We walked through the park, stopping to watch the pandas in their enclosures. The giant pandas were pretty lazy, just lying around chewing on bamboo. The red pandas were a little more active, moving through the trees and along wooden platforms. It was interesting enough, though not exactly thrilling. The crowds were manageable, and my guide was happy to point things out, talking about the pandas and the conservation efforts in China. I only half listened. Then I noticed the man. He wasn't doing anything at first, just walking behind us at a distance. He wore a beige trench coat, the kind you'd see in old detective movies, which was already weird considering how hot it was. Most people were in shorts and t-shirts, but he was in long sleeves, covered head to toe. He carried a black umbrella, which he opened and closed whenever he stepped in and out of the shade. That wasn't unusual. Like I said, people used umbrellas against the sun, but something about the way he did it felt off. He wasn't in a hurry, never too close, never too far. But every time I glanced back, he was still there. He wasn't taking pictures. He wasn't looking at the pandas. He was looking at us. At first, I tried to brush it off. Public places had all kinds of people. Maybe he was just some eccentric old guy, or maybe he had a skin condition that made him sensitive to the sun. But there was something about him that made my stomach feel tight. The way he watched us. His expression. He wasn't just looking, he was staring, his face pulled into this creepy, uncomfortable grin. I kept my eye on him as we moved through the park. We went to another enclosure, one of the quieter ones with fewer tourists. It was a shaded area where the red pandas had more room to climb, the path winding along a more secluded stretch of the park. That's when things got stranger. We stepped onto the path, and there he was, standing at the far end. His umbrella was open, the black fabric casting a shadow over his face. He didn't move. He just stood there, waiting. I slowed down. My guide didn't seem to notice him. She was still talking about the red pandas, pointing at one that was curled up on a branch. I wasn't listening anymore. The man was thin, almost sickly looking. His skin was pale, not in the way that some people just had light skin, but in an unnatural, almost grayish way, like he hadn't been in the sun in years. His lips stretched too wide when he smiled, his teeth visible even from where I was standing. Something was wrong with them. They weren't normal. They were sharp, jagged, uneven. I felt my body tense. This was the moment I should have turned around, should have told my guide that something was wrong. But I didn't. I wasn't scared, not exactly. More unsettled, like the feeling you get when you realize someone's been staring at you for too long. We kept walking. The closer we got, the more I could make out his face. His eyes were dark, deep-set. His smile didn't change, not even when we passed by him. He didn't say anything, just stood there, letting his gaze follow us as we walked past. Then we were around the bend, and he was gone. I glanced back a few times, but he wasn't following anymore. For a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just a weird guy. Maybe a tourist, maybe a local. China had over 1 billion people, and some of them were bound to be a little strange. But as we continued through the park, I saw him again. He was never right behind us, never obvious, but always close enough that I could spot him. Each time, he was standing just far enough away to not seem suspicious to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Each time, his umbrella would be open or closed depending on whether he was in the sun. And each time, he was smiling. The day went on like this. I kept an eye on him, and he kept watching. It was a game now, a silent, unsettling game where I knew he was following, and he knew I had noticed. I started paying attention to how he moved. He never seemed to be in a hurry, yet he was always where he needed to be. He never pushed through crowds or rushed to keep up. He would disappear and reappear, standing off to the side, lingering just long enough for me to spot him. At one point, I lost him completely. We were heading toward the exit, and for the first time all day, I couldn't see him anywhere. I told myself it was over, that he had finally gotten bored and left. Then, just as we stepped outside the park, I saw him again. He was standing near the entrance, his umbrella open, his head tilted slightly. And this time, he didn't just watch. He nodded, and then he smiled again, wider than before. The teeth were unmistakable. I didn't say anything to my guide. There was nothing to say. I didn't believe in vampires. I didn't believe in monsters. But I also didn't believe in coincidence. I never saw him again after that. But I never forgot him either. I was 5 or 6 when it happened. I had a cold, just a little one, I think, but enough that my dad sent me to bed in the middle of the day. My mom was at work, and my brother was somewhere in the house, but I don't remember where. The memory of that morning is soft, hazy, like I've pulled a blanket over it in my mind. I must have been sniffly. Maybe I had a sore throat, maybe I was just cranky. I don't remember having a fever, but I've told myself over the years that I must have. It's the only thing that makes sense. I remember lying on my back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the lightest hint of a breeze on my face. It was summer, and my windows were open. The thin curtains barely moved. The sun was high, its light too bright even through the glass, making the room glow with an orange kind of haze. I shut my eyes tight, trying to force myself to sleep. I never liked napping during the day. Something about it felt wrong, like I was missing out on something, like time moved strangely without me. The feeling of the breeze kept pulling me back, and finally, I opened my eyes. There were faces above me, floating, just heads, shoulders, and necks. I went stiff. My breath caught in my throat. There were 3, maybe 4 of them. They weren't touching the ceiling, but they weren't far from it. Dark hoods framed burned red skin, the kind of red that looks wrong, like something raw, something that shouldn't be seen. Their faces twisted into grins, smiles too wide, too stretched, skin pulled too tight. They had no eyes. Or maybe they did, but I couldn't see them. They started to move. Slowly at first, circling me. No sound, just the whisper of fabric shifting, the light brush of air against my face. Then laughter. Not sudden, not sharp. It built like a wave, quiet at first, rising, gathering, swelling until it filled every inch of the room. I clamped my hands over my ears, pressing as hard as I could, trying to make it stop. The laughter grew. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. I shut my eyes, squeezing them so tight it hurt. I curled in on myself, drawing my knees up, trying to make myself as small as possible. The sound didn't stop. It surrounded me. It crawled into my bones. I screamed. The door crashed open. My dad's hands were on me, shaking me, pulling me up. The laughter was gone. The room was empty. Sunlight streamed through the windows like nothing had happened, like the air hadn't been thick with noise just seconds before. My dad was saying something, his voice urgent, but I don't remember the words. I only remember shaking, my hands still pressed to my ears, my face wet. And then nothing. A blank space in my mind. I don't remember leaving the house. I don't remember walking to the car. But I remember being in it. The back seat was too big around me. I was small, curled up in the dip between the seats, my knees pressed hard against my chest. My mom was in the back with me, her legs on either side of me, arms around me. The car moved, but I barely felt it. I couldn't breathe. The laughter was still there, buried in the silence. I clamped my hands over my ears again. My fingers dug into my scalp. I rocked, pressing my forehead to my knees. They were back. They were still there. I don't know if I was speaking or screaming or just shaking, but my mom held me tight, like she was trying to shield me from something she couldn't see. The noise wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from inside the car. It was coming from nowhere, from everywhere, from the empty space that should have been quiet but wasn't. And then, nothing. Another blank space. I don't remember getting to the hospital. I don't remember what they did, what they said. I don't remember going home or what happened that night. But I remember the silence, the wrongness of it. Not quiet, not peace, but something else. Something pressing, something thick, something that made my skull feel like it was vibrating. I feel it sometimes, even now. When the world gets too quiet, when the air stops moving, when there's no hum of a fridge, no distant sound of traffic, no birds, no wind, just nothing. I wait for the laughter. It never comes, but I still press my hands to my ears, just in case. I was in 8th grade when my family took a trip to visit some friends who lived outside the country. It was a long trip, longer than I would have liked, and by the time we were in the last few days of our visit, I was exhausted. The days had been filled with outings, conversations, and constant movement, and I was at that age where I just wanted a little space to myself. The guest room had become my retreat whenever I needed a break, and that afternoon was one of those times. The house we were staying in was different from what I was used to. It was older, with thick walls that kept the heat out, and it had a slightly musty smell, like wood and dust mixed together. The windows had heavy curtains, which made the room comfortably dim even in the middle of the afternoon. There was a ceiling fan that spun lazily overhead, making a soft whirring sound that filled the quiet. It was the kind of place that made it easy to fall asleep, and I didn't even bother changing out of my regular clothes. I just lay down on the bed, facing the ceiling, and closed my eyes. I was in that state between sleep and wakefulness, where my body was heavy and my mind had started to drift. It felt nice, like I was floating in warmth, surrounded by the steady hum of the fan. Then, I felt something brush against my ear. It was light, barely noticeable, just the softest tickle on the outer edge of my ear. I had longish hair at the time, and with the fan on, I didn't think much of it. Just my hair moving. Nothing worth reacting to. I let it go, sinking deeper into that comfortable haze of sleep. Then, in an instant, I was wide awake. A sharp, skittering sensation ran straight into my ear canal. It was fast, sudden, like something had crawled inside in a split second before I even had time to react. And then, I felt it move deeper. Panic hit me so hard that I didn't even process what was happening at first. 1 second, I was on the edge of sleep. The next, I was clawing at the side of my head, letting out a strangled, panicked scream. The feeling of movement inside my ear was unbearable. It wasn't just a tickle. It was deep, intense, like something was forcing its way into a space it shouldn't be. It was alive, crawling, pushing further. I felt every movement, every shift, as it went deeper into the narrow, sensitive canal of my ear. I scrambled off the bed, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my fingers digging desperately into the side of my head, as though I could physically pull it out. My heartbeat pounded in my chest, and I could hear my own panicked breathing in my ears, along with something else. A new sound, a tiny high-pitched clicking. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that my panic had distorted the normal sounds of my body. But no, the noise was real, and it was coming from inside my ear. I felt my stomach twist with a sick kind of horror. The bug wasn't just crawling. It was making noises. Little chirps, tiny clicks, like it was trying to communicate with something, or struggling to find its way. The sound was sharp, unnatural, magnified by the fact that it was so close to my eardrum. I had never heard a noise like that in my life, and now it was inside of me. I stumbled toward the door, barely able to think, just reacting on pure instinct. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what would happen if it went deeper, if it could go deeper. The only thing I knew was that I couldn't get it out on my own. My mom ran into the room at the sound of my screams, but all I could do was clutch at the side of my head, my breath coming in quick, panicked gasps as I tried to explain what was happening. The words wouldn't come out right, just a jumble of bug. It's in my ear. It won't. Before I had to stop, because I could feel it moving again. I couldn't stop shaking. The sensation of something alive, something moving where nothing should ever move, was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It wasn't just disturbing, it was invasive. It was the kind of thing that sent my entire nervous system into overdrive, making every muscle in my body tense with the overwhelming need to get it out, to make it stop. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't do anything. It was inside me. And then the chirping got louder. My mom grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the bathroom. She was moving quickly, but she stayed calm, and some part of me latched onto that, onto the idea that maybe she had an answer, a solution, something to make it stop. She told me to tilt my head toward the light, angling my ear toward the bright bathroom bulb. Bugs go toward the light. That was the logic. Maybe if it saw an opening, it would come back out. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to control my breathing as I tilted my head and waited. The minutes stretched on, but nothing happened. The bug didn't move toward the opening. It didn't react to the light. It was still inside, still moving, still making that awful clicking noise. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream again, but none of that would help. Then, my mom said we needed to flush it out. She filled a cup with water and held it up to my ear, tipping my head to the side so the water would flow in. I had a split second to brace myself before the cold rush filled my ear canal, pushing against the space where the bug had lodged itself. I felt it react instantly. A tiny high-pitched squeak, like a noise of surprise. It had never occurred to me that a bug could make a sound like that, but there it was. A small, startled noise, like it hadn't expected to be suddenly submerged. The realization sent a fresh wave of horror through me, but I forced myself to stay still, to hold my head at the right angle. Seconds passed. Then I heard it. A strange, sad gurgling sound, like something struggling, something drowning. The chirping stopped. The movement stopped. And then nothing. I swallowed hard. "I think it's dead," I managed to say, my voice hoarse from the panic. My mom nodded and finally let me dump the water out of my ear. I tilted my head over the sink, shaking slightly as the water trickled out. I expected to see the bug, to have some kind of proof that it was gone, but nothing came out except for the water. I told myself it had fallen out at some point, maybe when I was wiping my ear. Maybe it had broken apart. Maybe it had been small enough to wash away without a trace. But I never saw it. For weeks, I obsessed over the feeling. I checked my ear constantly, half expecting to feel something skitter back to life, to hear that clicking noise again. I even went to the doctor later, just to be sure, but they never found anything. It was gone. And yet, even now, all these years later, whenever I feel the smallest itch near my ear, just the faintest tickle, my body tenses up. My breath catches. My hand moves automatically to check, to make sure there's nothing there. Because I know what it feels like. I know what it sounds like. And I never, ever want to feel it again. The first time I saw the house, I remember thinking how out of place it seemed. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, towering over the land around it, surrounded by trees that had stood just as long as it had. A monstrous brick structure, built in the early 1800s, fully restored to something close to its original state. It was beautiful in a way that old things often are, full of character, heavy with history. But even then, I could feel something about it. Not necessarily bad, just present. My bride's parents had owned it for years, long before I entered the picture. They were proud of it, loved telling people about its history. It had been a plantation house once, a relic of an era better left in the past, but it stood unchanged, full of the weight of lives that had moved through it. That history was built into the walls, literally. Behind every wall, there were narrow corridors, hidden staircases that led from the upper floors to the kitchen and master bedroom, meant for the slaves to move unseen. The basement held something worse. A room with a handle only on the outside, once used to hold slaves. A coal room, once the main source of heat for the house, still bore the metal eye hooks where people had once been chained, their beds hanging from the walls. When I first heard about these things, I did what most rational people do. I nodded, acknowledged the discomfort, but didn't dwell on it. After all, the house was just a house. It wasn't alive. It wasn't aware of what had happened inside it. At least, that's what I told myself. It wasn't long before I started to notice things. The first was the animals. Every animal, without exception, avoided the slave corridors, the basement, and the two staircases leading from them. My wife's parents had a cat, an old, fat thing that spent most of its time sleeping on the couch. But the moment it got near one of those staircases, its entire demeanor would change. Years back, fur raised, staring at the entrance like something was inside. And it wasn't just the cat. We visited one weekend, bringing our dog with us. He was a big mutt, normally fearless, but when I tried to take him out to the yard using the staircase behind the kitchen, he panicked. Not just nervousness, full-blown terror. The second the entrance to the staircase came into view, he bolted, slipping on the polished wooden floors, claws scrabbling uselessly as he tried to get away. I tried again, thinking maybe he smelled something strange. But no, both staircases and the basement door sent him into the same frantic panic. I had to take him outside through the front door every time. That was strange, but still, I tried to rationalize it. Then came the thing with the kittens. When my in-laws first moved in, they had 2 kittens. Every day, without fail, they would come home to find them inside clay pots with the lids on. These weren't just open pots. These were completely covered, placed inside the locked pantry under the stairs. No sign of how they got there. No sign of how the lids had been placed on top. It happened over and over, almost daily, for the first year they lived there. That was harder to explain. But the worst, at least, the thing that unsettled me the most, happened not long ago. My mother-in-law had found a pair of true silver candlestick holders when they first moved in. Beautiful things, clearly antique. Over the years, she'd bought several replicas, nearly indistinguishable from the originals, and placed them throughout the house. Then one day, the real silver holders disappeared, along with her mother's wedding ring set. Nothing else was taken. None of the expensive electronics, none of the valuables left in plain sight. It wasn't a break-in, not in the traditional sense. The only things missing were the silver and the rings. We searched. Every drawer, every cabinet. Nothing. 2 days later, the furnace in the basement went out. My father-in-law asked me to help him fix it, so we went down together. The basement was colder than usual. We walked past the coal room, and something caught my eye. A glimmer of light, reflecting off something in the back of the room. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit the dust, but it was too solid, too deliberate. We stepped inside. There, in the back, resting on the dirt floor, were the silver candlestick holders and my mother-in-law's wedding set. The moment we saw them, something settled in my gut. A sickness. Not a fear, exactly, more like an overwhelming wrongness. Like something was watching, waiting to see what we'd do. We grabbed the items and left, bringing them upstairs. My mother-in-law barely reacted. She just put them back in their original place, saying, "If they take them again, they can just stay down there. We're merely borrowing them from the house, but they can't have my mom's wedding set." And that was that. She never mentioned it again, but I couldn't let it go. A few nights later, when everyone had gone to bed, I went back down. I needed to know if there was a rational explanation. Maybe the floor was uneven. Maybe an animal had dragged the items down there. Maybe something had fallen, shifted, moved them in a way that made sense. The basement was colder than before. I stepped into the coal room, flashlight in hand, and checked the floor. No signs of movement, no signs of animals. But the coal dust, thick, undisturbed except for my own footprints, bore one clear mark. A snake trail. I followed it with my light, tracking it across the floor, until it disappeared into a crack in the stone wall. Something about that crack felt deeper than it should have been, like it wasn't just a break in the stone, but something else, a space beyond. I didn't investigate further. I left the basement, locked the door behind me, and haven't gone back down since. It started as just another afternoon, another one of those days where the boredom gets unbearable, and the only thing to do is go outside and find something, anything, to kill the time. The woods near my neighborhood weren't exactly unexplored. We'd been out there plenty of times, wandering, finding old beer cans, rusted-out car parts, the occasional lost jacket or busted-up tent someone had abandoned. It was the kind of place where you always felt like you might stumble onto something weird, something no one was supposed to see. There were 4 of us that day. It was early in the year, still cold enough that you needed a hoodie, but not so cold that you couldn't spend hours outside. The trees were mostly bare, their twisted, leafless branches reaching up to the gray sky. The ground was damp, muddy in some spots, dead leaves mashed down into the dirt from the last rain. We walked without any real direction, just moving deeper into the woods, talking about random stuff, kicking at rocks and sticks as we went. It was my friend up ahead who saw it first. The tiny house, tucked away between the trees, almost swallowed up by the overgrowth. It wasn't like a regular abandoned house, the kind you see with a collapsed roof and vines taking over. It was just wrong. Smaller than it should have been, more like a shed someone had tried to turn into a home. The windows were shattered, jagged glass still clinging to the edges of the frames. The front door was busted open, barely hanging on by one hinge. In front of it, a small pond sat still and dark, covered in patches of green algae, the kind of water that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. None of us had ever seen this place before, and that alone was weird, because we'd been in these woods so many times. We walked around it first, just taking it in. The shed out back looked even worse than the house. The walls had holes in them, the roof sagging, like a strong wind could knock it over. Inside, we found a mess of old books, some rotted so bad you couldn't read the covers, pages stuck together in damp clumps. There were these weird metal tubes sticking out of the ground, attached to massive rusted cans buried deep. I didn't know what they were for, but something about them made me uneasy. It wasn't just junk, it was too deliberate, too placed. And then there was the tiny fenced-in area. 5 yards across, barbed wire lining the top, but the fence itself was bent inward, like it was made to keep something inside. We should have stopped there. We should have taken one look at that place and walked away. But of course we didn't. Getting inside was easy. There were no doors or windows left intact to stop us. The first floor was a mess, but nothing too strange. Broken glass, some old furniture falling apart, a few empty cans scattered around like maybe someone had squatted there at some point. The floor creaked under our weight, and the air had that stale, rotting wood smell. It was the stairs that changed everything. I didn't want to go up. I was already on edge, but I wasn't about to be the only one staying behind. I took the last spot in our line, moving up slowly. The steps groaned under us, loud in the silence. The second my friend at the front of the line reached the top, the air shifted. A gust of wind, sudden and ice cold, rushed down the stairs, hitting us all at once. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just a draft from a broken window. It felt like something was pushing through us, like something moved past us in the opposite direction. And then my friend at the front bolted. He didn't say anything, didn't even hesitate. He just turned and sprinted down, shoving past us so fast we barely had time to react. I didn't think. I just followed. We all did. The next thing I knew, we were outside, standing in the dirt, breathing hard, trying to understand what had just happened. He was shaking. I'd never seen him like that before. And then he said it. He saw people, but not normal people. Clear people. The others laughed it off. They teased him, called him crazy, said he was just scaring himself. I didn't laugh. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, trying to ignore the way my stomach felt like it had dropped to the ground. 2 of my friends decided to go back inside. They were the type who always had to prove they weren't scared, who couldn't let something go. One stayed outside with the guy who ran, and I, like an idiot, followed the others back in. We moved slower this time, back up the stairs, careful, hesitant. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short and shallow. And then we saw it. The floor was covered in them. Dead squirrels. Dozens of them, skinned, their tiny bodies curled up, their fur ripped away. The air was thick with the smell of rot, a sickening, sweet stench that clung to the back of my throat. And on the walls, drawn in something dark, something that looked like dried blood, were symbols. Circles, lines, shapes I didn't understand. A pentagram, bold and sharp, carved deep into the wooden floor. I didn't think. I ran. I barely noticed my friends running too. I barely noticed anything except the desperate need to be outside, to be away from that place. We didn't stop until we were out in the open, gasping for breath, standing in silence, not looking at each other. And then we saw him. My friend, the one who had stayed outside, was gone. A blur in the distance, running full speed through the trees. We turned back to the house, back to the broken window on the second floor. And there he was, the skinniest man I had ever seen. Gaunt, almost skeletal, his skin stretched tight over his face. He stood motionless, staring straight at me, his eyes locked onto mine. He didn't move. He didn't blink. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally turned and ran. We made it home, but nothing felt safe. We told my parents, but they didn't believe us. Of course they didn't. It was just another dumb story, another dumb adventure. But I know what I saw. We've been back a few times just to see. Never close, never inside again. But the house is still there. The pond is still there. The shed, the fenced-in area, all of it. And the nightmares haven't stopped. I don't know what we walked into that day. I don't think I want to know. But I do know one thing. Whatever was in that house, whatever was watching us, it's still out there. It was late, and the road stretched ahead of me, empty and dark. The countryside was always like this at night. No streetlights, no traffic, just long, winding roads cutting through fields and forests, the occasional farmhouse set far back from the road, its windows dark. I had driven this way before, but something about the silence of the night made everything feel different. The air was thick, and the only sound was the steady hum of my tires on the pavement. I was on my way home, tired after a long day. My headlights cast long shadows on the road, illuminating the trees on either side, their branches reaching out like arms. There was no moon that night, just an inky black sky stretching over the hills. I was alone out here, and I knew it. Then, up ahead, something broke the monotony of the road. A tree had fallen across it, blocking the way. My heart sank as I slowed down. It wasn't small. There was no way I could just drive over it. I stopped the car and kept my hands on the wheel, staring at it for a moment. I wasn't sure what to do. I reached for my phone, but saw that I had no signal. Typical. Out here, there were dead zones everywhere. I put the car in park and sighed, looking around. The road was narrow, and the tree took up the entire width of it. Maybe I could drive around it? I opened the door and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The air was cold, colder than I expected, and it smelled like damp earth. My breath came out in small clouds as I walked toward the tree. I stepped carefully, listening to the quiet around me. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it was just because of how isolated I was. There was nothing out here except me, my car, and the tree. I walked around to the side of the road, looking for a gap between the branches where I might squeeze through. But the ditch beside the road was too steep. Even if I managed to drive around it, I'd probably get stuck in the mud. There was no choice. I had to turn around and find another way home. I turned back toward my car and hurried, suddenly feeling exposed standing out in the open like that. The darkness pressed in around me, and I didn't like the way the trees seemed to loom over me. I got back inside, locking the doors as soon as I was in. I shifted into reverse and carefully backed up until I could turn around. The road was narrow, and it took a few tries, but soon I was heading back the way I came. My hands felt clammy on the steering wheel, and I tried to shake off the strange feeling in my gut. After a few minutes of driving, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. A single light, bright and high off the ground. A motorcycle. That wasn't unusual. Bikers sometimes took these back roads to avoid traffic. But something felt off. The bike was keeping its distance, but I could tell it was following me. The rider wasn't passing me, wasn't turning off, just trailing behind. I sped up slightly. The bike did too. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence. But then the light flickered, like the rider had flashed his high beams at me. My stomach tightened. I kept driving, gripping the wheel harder. My heart was pounding now. Every time I checked the mirror, the bike was still there, keeping pace. I tried to stay calm, but my fingers trembled as I held the wheel. The road twisted and turned, and I took the curves as fast as I dared, but the bike never fell behind. The rider flashed the high beams again. This time it was quick, off, then on again, like he was signaling me. I couldn't take it anymore. I floored it. My tires skidded slightly on the gravel shoulder as I pushed the car faster. The road was dangerous at high speeds, but I didn't care. I needed to get home. The bike didn't let up. It stayed behind me, matching my speed. My chest felt tight, my breaths coming quick and shallow. I kept telling myself that if I could just make it home, everything would be fine. My house wasn't far now. I took the last few turns recklessly, barely slowing down. My only goal to get to the driveway, to get inside, to be safe. Finally, I saw my driveway. I swerved into it, tires screeching. The bike followed. I didn't even take the time to turn off the car. I threw the door open and ran for the house. I burst inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath ragged. My dad was in the living room. He stood up, alarmed, but I could barely get the words out. Someone bike following me. Before I could finish, the sound of the motorcycle engine cut off outside. My dad moved past me, stepping onto the porch. I hesitated, but I followed him to the door, peeking outside. The rider had gotten off the bike. He was breathing hard, his helmet still on. My dad squared his shoulders, ready to confront him. I watched, my heart still hammering in my chest. Then the biker pointed toward my car. I followed his gesture, confused, my stomach twisting. The back door of my car, on the side I hadn't checked before, was open. Wide open. I felt the blood drain from my face. I hadn't opened that door. I hadn't touched it. I had been driving the whole way home, and I had never heard it open. I had never noticed anything. I stepped back from the door, shaking my head. My dad was saying something to the biker, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't think. Someone had been in my car. I felt sick. My head was spinning, my skin crawling. I thought back to the tree in the road, to the moment I had stepped out, leaving my car unlocked. I had only been gone for a minute, maybe two. That was all it had taken. I turned and ran back into the house, locking the door behind me. My dad stayed outside a little longer, then finally came back in. The biker was gone. My dad locked the front door, checking the other locks in the house. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Eventually, he just said, "Get some rest." But I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, my dad drove back to where I had left my car on the road. He found nothing. No signs of anyone, no footprints, no clues. The only thing that was left behind was that awful, sinking feeling in my stomach. I had been driving home, completely unaware that someone had been sitting just feet behind me. I had never even noticed. And that was the worst part of all. I was 6, maybe 7, when my family moved into that house. It was old, one of those narrow 2-story homes with high ceilings and creaky wooden floors. The kind of house that always felt dim no matter how many lights you turned on. I remember the first time I stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick in a way I couldn't explain, like stepping into someone else's life instead of a new home. My parents were thrilled about the place, talking about all the space we'd have, how it was a steal for the price. I didn't understand any of that. I just knew that I didn't like how it smelled, like dust and something faintly sour, like old wood that had been wet for too long. My brother and I shared a room upstairs. The house had 3 bedrooms, but one was too small, barely more than a closet, so my parents took the bigger room down the hall. Our room had a window facing the backyard, which stretched into a line of trees. I didn't like that window. The glass was old, slightly warped, and at night, when the wind blew through the trees, it cast strange shifting shadows against the walls. The first time we saw her, we were playing on the floor. I had a few matchbox cars, rolling them back and forth, making quiet engine noises under my breath. My brother was setting up some kind of race, lining them up in a row. The carpet was rough under my hands, some old brown thing that had been there long before us, its fibers flattened from years of footsteps. I don't know why we both looked up at the same time, but we did. She was just there, standing over us like she had been watching the whole time. An old woman, her dress reaching her ankles, something pale blue with tiny buttons down the front. She had a frilly collar, a little brooch pinned at her neck, and her white hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her face was lined, deep wrinkles running from her nose to the corners of her mouth, her expression stiff and unreadable. She lifted one hand and wagged her finger, slow and deliberate, like she was scolding us. I didn't scream. Neither did my brother. We just sat there, frozen, watching her. And then she was gone. We didn't say anything at first. I think we were both waiting for the other to explain it, to make sense of it. But there was nothing to say. She had been there. Then she wasn't. It happened again, and again. Sometimes we'd be playing. Sometimes I'd be sitting on the bed tying my shoes, or looking out the window. I'd feel something, not a noise, not a movement, just a shift in the air, a change in pressure. And I'd turn my head, and she would be there, watching, frowning, that same slow wag of her finger before she disappeared. I told my mom once. She laughed. "Maybe she just doesn't like little boys making a mess," she said, tousling my hair. My dad joked that it was just my imagination, that maybe I wanted an old lady to keep me in line. They didn't see her. Only we did. The house wasn't right in other ways. At night, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway. Soft, measured, the kind of sound someone makes when they're walking slowly, carefully, like they don't want to wake anyone up. But no one was awake. My brother was asleep in the bed across from me. My parents' door was shut, and still, the footsteps would go back and forth, all night long. One night, I woke up to the sound of my name. A whisper, barely more than a breath, just outside the bedroom door. I turned onto my side, staring at the dark hallway through the open door. My brother shifted in his bed, rolling over in his sleep, but he didn't wake up. I lay there for a long time, eyes wide, waiting for something to move. The next day, I told my mom that I wanted the door closed at night. She just nodded and said okay. It didn't help. The footsteps were louder when the door was closed. The sound pressed against the wood like someone pacing just outside, waiting. I started sleeping with the blanket over my head, pressing my hands against my ears to block it out. It didn't always work. The cold spots started after that. The kitchen was the worst. Sometimes I'd walk in, and it would feel normal, warm from the oven or the afternoon sun. Other times, I'd step through the doorway, and the air would be so cold that my skin would prickle, my breath coming out in a faint white puff. I'd tell my mom, but she'd just shake her head, saying the house was old, drafty, that it needed better insulation. One night, I woke up with the feeling that something was watching me. Not like the old woman. This was different. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Then I saw it. A shadow on my window. A hand. Large, fingers spread wide, its edges glowing faintly from the streetlight outside. It wasn't my own. It wasn't my brother's. It was pressed against the glass, unmoving, like someone was standing right outside my second-story window. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared. And then, slowly, the shadow faded. Like whoever, or whatever, it belonged to had stepped back into the darkness. I didn't tell anyone about that. I don't know why. Maybe I knew they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I didn't want to hear my dad's logical explanations, my mom's reassurances. I just wanted to forget. We moved out after 3 months. My parents never really explained why. I asked once years later, and my mom just shook her head. It just wasn't a good fit, she said, like she was talking about a pair of shoes that didn't quite fit right. But the dreams started after we left. Vivid, suffocating dreams. Always the same. The doll. My mom had this Raggedy Andy doll, old and faded, its fabric soft from years of handling. I never liked it, never liked the way its black stitched eyes seemed to follow me. But after we moved, I started dreaming about it. Night after night. In the dreams, it moved on its own. It would sit at the foot of my bed, head tilted slightly, its arms limp at its sides. I'd try to move, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, frozen. I could only watch as it slid off the bed, its fabric feet dragging against the floor. It would grab my ankle, its grip strong, pulling, dragging me down. I'd wake up gasping, sweat soaking my shirt. The dreams didn't stop. Not after a week. Not after a year. They went on for nearly 8 years. I tried getting rid of the doll once. Took it outside, left it in the garage, but my mom just brought it back in, setting it on the shelf in the living room like it belonged there. And maybe it did. I'm 34 now. I don't live with my parents anymore. But sometimes when I visit, I see it. Sitting in the same spot, its head turned slightly to the side, as if it's listening, watching. I don't sit in the same room with it. I can't. Even now, after all these years, I feel it. That weight in the air, that thick, suffocating presence. Like the house we left never really let go. Like it followed me. I had only been in the city for a few months, still getting used to the noise, the crowds, the way the streets felt alive even late at night. It was nothing like the small town I had come from, where everything shut down by 9, where you could walk down an empty road in the dark and only hear your own footsteps. Here, the sidewalks were packed, even as the bars started emptying out, and the air smelled like car exhaust, stale beer, and food from the late-night street vendors on the corners. That night, I had gone out with a friend to drink downtown. It was the first time I had really let loose since moving, finally starting to feel like maybe I could settle into this place. We had a few drinks at some bars, nothing crazy, just enough to get a warm buzz, enough to make the night feel lighter, easier. We laughed, talked about work, about life, about how different the city felt compared to where we used to live. The night stretched on, and at some point, we realized we needed to catch our buses home. We weren't staying too far from each other, but still far enough that we had to split up at some point. We walked toward the bus stop together, standing near the curb as cars passed by in streaks of red and white lights. The city wasn't quiet, not completely, but it had reached that point where the energy had started to die down. People had either gone home or were too drunk to care about anything other than getting another drink. It was late, but not late enough that we were alone. There were still some people walking by, waiting at other bus stops, talking in small groups on the sidewalks. I wasn't really paying attention to anything around us until I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. I turned my head and saw a man standing just a few feet away from us. He looked rough, like he had been on the streets for a while. His clothes were dirty, his hair was matted in places, his eyes darting around too quickly like he couldn't focus. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. He asked us if we had any change. It was a simple question, one I had heard before, one that didn't necessarily mean anything bad was going to happen. But something about him put me on edge. Maybe it was the way he stood too close, the way he stared a little too hard, the way his voice didn't match his expression. My friend and I both shook our heads, polite but firm. No, sorry, we didn't have anything. We turned slightly, angling ourselves away from him, ready to step toward a busier part of the street. He took a step forward. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached above the hum of the city, he said, "Maybe if I shove this knife in your neck, you'll change your mind." The words didn't register at first. It was like my brain refused to process them, refused to believe that's what I had actually heard. But then I saw the slight shift in his posture, the way his hand twitched near his side, and suddenly, it felt like the air around me had dropped 10 degrees. I didn't look for a knife. I didn't want to know if he had won or not. The threat alone was enough. My friend, and I didn't say anything, didn't react in a way that would set him off. We just moved. Not fast, not slow, just enough to put some distance between us. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my body tensing up like I was preparing to run, even though I knew running wasn't an option. He followed. Every step we took, he matched. Close enough that I could hear his breathing, too steady, too calm for someone who had just said something like that. My eyes darted around, looking for someone, anyone. Then I saw him, a police officer, standing across the street near a parked patrol car, his arms crossed as he watched the street. It wasn't even a thought, it was instinct. I raised my hand, waved him over, the movement sharp, desperate. The officer noticed immediately. Everything happened fast after that. The man must have realized what was happening because he turned sharply and walked in the opposite direction. But he didn't run. He just blended back into the crowd, like he had never been there to begin with. The cop didn't hesitate. He moved, stepping into the street, cutting through traffic without even looking, his presence suddenly larger, more commanding. I watched as he scanned the sidewalk, looking for the man, but he was already gone. We gave descriptions, tried to recall as many details as we could, but it all felt like a blur. The officer listened, his expression unreadable, then asked where we were headed. We explained that we had missed our last buses. Without even pausing, he offered to drive us home. The ride was silent. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window, still trying to process what had just happened. The city looked different now. The lights felt too harsh, the streets too empty. My friend was dropped off first, and I watched as they disappeared into their building, the cop waiting until they were inside before driving off again. When we pulled up to my house, the flashing lights from the patrol car must have caught my dad's attention. The door swung open before I even got out. He stepped onto the porch, his expression hard, angry. For a split second, I thought he assumed I was in trouble, that I had done something to get myself brought home in the back of a cop car. Then he saw that I wasn't in handcuffs. My mom appeared behind him, confusion on her face. The officer explained briefly, nothing too detailed, just that there had been an incident, that I was fine, that he wanted to make sure I got home safe. When the car pulled away, the reality of everything finally set in. I told them what had happened, every detail, every moment, my voice shaking even though I didn't want it to. My dad's expression shifted from anger to something else, something I couldn't quite place. My mom covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide, horrified. Then came the worst part. The officer had told me one last thing before he left. The man who had threatened us hadn't just been some random guy on the street. He had escaped from a prison up north. He was on the run. I don't remember much of what my parents said after that. I just remember going inside, locking every door, checking the windows, double-checking, triple-checking. For a long time after that, I couldn't walk through the city at night without feeling like someone was behind me. I flinched at strangers who got too close. I kept my head down, my hands clenched into fists, my body tense and ready to move at the first sign of danger. I had wanted to believe that the city was just another place, that it wasn't so different from where I had come from. But that night changed everything. It made me realize that danger didn't always come in the ways you expected, that sometimes it crept up on you in the middle of a busy street, whispered in your ear, and walked away like it had never been there at all. I was living at my grandmother's house when my dad took it over after she went into the nursing home. The house had been in the family for years, a small, older place with outdated wallpaper, creaky floors, and heavy furniture that hadn't been moved in decades. My grandmother had been deeply religious, the kind of woman who kept crosses in every room, had Bible verses framed on the walls, and always warned us about things she claimed to have seen or experienced. One story she told more than once was about the time she had tried to perform an exorcism on her neighbor. It was something she spoke about seriously, always with a lowered voice, like she didn't even want the walls to hear. She said the neighbor had been acting strange for a long time, and one night she had gone over to try and help. She never got into specifics, just that it hadn't worked, that the house had always felt wrong after that, and that some things you just shouldn't try to fight alone. I never knew if she really believed it, or if it was just something she told herself to make sense of whatever had happened, but either way, it stuck with me. By the time I was living there, the house had developed a reputation among my friends. It wasn't that anything big had ever happened, nothing that would make it into a horror movie, but it had this weird way of making itself known. Lights flickering when there was no reason, sounds in the walls that didn't sound like pipes or settling wood, objects not being where you left them. Little things, easy enough to dismiss on their own, but over time they built up. One night in 2010, I had some friends over. We were just hanging out in the dining room, which was part of a large open space connected to the living room. The kitchen was just off to the side, and past that was the small computer room where I kept my old desktop. That computer was my main source of music, loaded with about 16 gigs worth of songs. We had been listening to music, just talking, not really paying attention to what was playing in the background. At some point, I don't know when exactly, the music stopped. None of us noticed at first. We kept talking, laughing, just killing time. Then there was this brief lull in the conversation, one of those moments where everyone just naturally pauses at the same time. And that's when it hit us. The music had stopped. It was weird because no one had gone back there to pause it. The computer wasn't on shuffle or anything that would cause it to suddenly stop. It should have kept playing. Someone pointed it out, and we all kind of looked at each other, waiting for someone to offer an explanation. Then, just barely audible at first, there was a sound. It came from the computer room. At first, it was subtle, like distant footsteps, but not the kind you'd expect in a house. These sounded sharp, deliberate, like high heels clicking against pavement. It had this odd echo to it, like it was being played from inside a narrow alleyway, bouncing off the walls. It got louder. We all got up and went to check. When we turned the corner into the room, the screensaver was on, the monitor glowing faintly in the dark. No one had touched it. The speakers were playing the sound of footsteps, growing faster, almost frantic. Then, without warning, a woman screamed. It wasn't just any scream. It was the kind that makes your stomach drop, the kind that sounds like pure terror. It lasted only a second or two, but it felt stretched out, like the sound filled the entire house. And then, as suddenly as it started, the Ghostbusters theme song blasted through the speakers. It was jarring, ridiculous even, but not funny. It didn't feel like a joke. We scrambled for the mouse, moved it to wake up the screen, trying to see where it was coming from. iTunes was open, but it was paused. There were no internet tabs, no files playing, nothing. The track just didn't exist. We sat there staring at the screen, the absurdity of the situation making it almost worse. It was like something had been messing with us, something that had been waiting for us to notice. And when we did, it decided to throw in a punchline. That wasn't the first time something weird had happened in that house, and it wasn't the last. A few months earlier, during a storm, the power had gone out around 2 a.m. The whole house went dark, the only light coming in from the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. I was half asleep when an alarm clock started blaring from the other room. At first, I thought it was my phone, but when I reached for it, I realized it wasn't the right sound. It was one of those old digital alarms, the kind that had the red numbers and a built-in radio. The problem was, I didn't own one. I got up, heart pounding, and followed the noise to the living room. The power was out. Everything was off. But that alarm was screaming like it had a full battery. I found it on a shelf near the TV, a small, dusty thing I had never seen before. The buttons didn't work. I tried to turn it off, to unplug it, but there was no cord. It shouldn't have been working. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I took it outside the next morning and left it in the trash. The house was full of things like that. Objects moving just enough to make you second-guess yourself. Lights flickering only when you were alone in a room. Sounds in the walls at night, just faint enough that you could convince yourself you imagined them. I lived there for a while before eventually moving out. My dad stayed, but he never liked talking about the weird things that happened. He brushed them off, always had some logical reason, but I could tell he didn't really believe it. Years later, after my grandmother passed, we had to go through the house to clean it out. I hadn't been back in a long time. It felt different, emptier, but not in the way you'd expect. We went through her old belongings, sorting through boxes of clothes, papers, and the kind of knickknacks old women tend to collect. In one of the boxes, we found a small leather-bound book. Inside, in her handwriting, were pages filled with prayers. Some were familiar, the kind you'd hear in church, but others were strange, written like instructions. On one of the last pages, there was a note. Underscore some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Underscore. I don't know if she was talking about her neighbor or something else, but I never went back to that house again. Let me start by saying that I can see the house from where I sit right now. My desk is set up in front of the window, and from here, I can clearly see the place where all of this happened. It's strange how, after all these years, I ended up living right across from it. Stranger still that I moved into that house later on. Even now, I catch myself staring at it sometimes, wondering if I imagined everything. But the truth is, I know what I saw, and what I felt. When I was 13, my best friend lived right across the street. His parents were good friends with my dad, so I spent a lot of time at their house. It didn't matter what time it was, morning, afternoon, late at night. I could walk over whenever I wanted. We'd hang out, play GameCube, talk about stupid things, and sometimes I'd stay the night. It felt normal, like any other childhood friendship. But there was something about that house, something I didn't really pay attention to until that night. It was around 2 in the morning. I had been at my friend's house for hours, but I decided to head home. It wasn't a big deal. The walk wasn't far, just a short distance across a dirt field filled with weeds. I'd done it so many times that I didn't think twice about it. But that night, the air felt different. The moment I stepped outside, a chill ran through me, raising goosebumps along my arms. I remember rubbing them, trying to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me. The air was still, no wind, no rustling leaves, just a deep silence that settled in my ears like cotton. I kept walking. The field stretched out beside me, dark and empty, and as I moved forward, I turned my head slightly and saw something. A shape, a silhouette of a person leaning against my neighbor's fence. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the darkness, a shadow cast by something I couldn't see. I told myself not to panic, to just act normal, like I hadn't noticed it. I kept walking, my feet moving slower now, my breath tight in my chest. But after another few steps, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced back. The silhouette wasn't just standing there anymore. It was glowing, not like a flashlight or a street lamp. It was a dim, white light, not blinding but unnatural, like it was lit from the inside. The sight of it pulled at me. My body shifted direction before I even realized what I was doing. My feet carried me toward it. It didn't feel like my own choice. I was just moving, like something had taken over. I had gone maybe 15 feet closer when I heard it. A laugh, deep, guttural, vibrating through my chest. My legs locked in place. The silhouette changed shape. The glow twisted, stretched, warped, and then I saw them, horns. Something snapped in my brain, breaking whatever trance I had been under. Terror hit me like a slap to the face, my stomach twisting so hard I thought I would throw up. I bolted, full speed, straight for my friend's house. The sound of footsteps. Fast, heavy, gaining on me. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. No shape, no movement, just that empty field. But the second I looked forward again, I saw it. Standing in front of my friend's house, staring into his window. It wasn't running, it wasn't chasing, it was just there. Watching. The laugh came again. The same deep, stomach-turning sound. I had nowhere to go. If I ran back, I'd be going straight toward the field. If I kept running forward, I'd be heading right for it. My brain scrambled for a plan, something, anything, and then I remembered. His parents kept a garage door opener in their car. I sprinted toward the driveway, ripping open the car door and fumbling under the seat. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I slammed my thumb against the button. The garage door started to rise. Panting. Close. Footsteps, heavy and uneven, getting nearer. The second the door lifted enough, I dove under. As I slid through, something grabbed me, or at least, that's what it felt like. A pressure clamped around my ankle, tight and burning, and I screamed. A flash of light. Bright. Sudden. I hit the garage door button again, my hands scrambling against the wall. The door lowered, shutting me inside. My breath came in ragged gasps. My body was shaking, but that pressure, that grip, it was gone. I don't remember how long I sat there, trying to get my breathing under control. Eventually, I found my way inside. I told my friend what had happened, expecting him to laugh at me or call me crazy. But he didn't. Instead, his face went pale. He told me he had seen things, too. For months. Out in the lot. Outside his window. And whenever he saw them, he wouldn't move. He'd squeeze his eyes shut and pretend he didn't see anything. We tried to forget about it. We put on a movie, something dumb to distract ourselves. But halfway through, we heard it. A scratching sound behind us. We turned around. A silhouette. Inside. I don't know how long we sat there, frozen, staring at it. My friend whispered, "Don't move." I stayed still. My heart pounded against my ribs. The shape just stood there, watching us. And then, it slammed its hand against the glass. We lost it. Screaming, running, hiding under blankets like little kids. His dad came out angry, asking what was wrong. We told him everything. He shook his head, said it was our imaginations. But it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, my friend kept calling me in the middle of the night, saying he saw them. Silhouettes, moving around my house. I woke my dad up once, told him someone was outside. He went out, found nothing. But I saw them, right outside my window. My friend was still on the phone when it happened. He started screaming. He said they were in his house. Then I heard it, banging on his door. Loud, aggressive. His screaming got worse. His parents came in, and suddenly it all stopped. A week later, they moved. They never said why. Not long after, my family moved into that house. It's been years now. I live here alone. My dad gave me the house as a gift, told me to take care of it. And I do. I keep it clean. I maintain the yard. I try to ignore the way my skin crawls at night when I look out the window. Because every now and then, I still see them. Just standing there. Watching. I don't know what they are. I don't think I ever will. When I was a kid, I never thought too much about the strange things that happened around me. It was just normal. Other kids talked about imaginary friends, so I figured the voices I heard, the shadows I saw, the feeling of being watched. It was all just part of growing up. I never told anyone about it, not really. When you're a kid, you don't know what's supposed to be normal and what's not. But looking back, I see it was never normal. My mom was never superstitious. She didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. But when I was around 2 years old, she bought a Ouija board. She said it was just for fun, just something to mess around with. I was too young to remember any of this, but she told me later, years later, about what happened. She said she used it a lot, just by herself in the living room after I'd gone to bed. And every time she used it, she ended up talking to the same spirit. He said his name was Henry. At first, she thought it was funny. A little boy, 8 years old, answering her questions. But then he started saying things that made her uncomfortable. He said he hated me. He said I took his place in the world. That my mother was supposed to be his mother. He told her she wasn't supposed to have me. She was supposed to have him. She stopped using the board after that. She never told me what she said back to him, if anything. Just that she packed the board away and never touched it again. I didn't know any of this growing up. All I knew was that weird things happened in our house. I'd hear scratching sounds in the walls, like nails dragging over wood. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up to the sound of my closet door creaking open, but it would be empty when I turned on the light. The worst part was the voices. They were never loud, never clear. Just whispers at the edge of my hearing. I could never make out what they were saying, but I knew they were there. When I was really little, maybe 3 or 4, I used to talk to something I called the Black Man. I don't remember much, but my parents told me I talked about him all the time. They thought it was just a little kid's imagination, until I described him. I told them he was tall and thin, with dark clothes and a sad face. My parents went pale when they heard that. That was the exact description of the landlord's husband, who had died years before we moved in. He died while fixing the house, fell from the roof. I guess my parents started getting freaked out after that. My mom tried to brush it off, but my dad hated talking about it. He wasn't the type to believe in anything supernatural, but I could tell it made him uncomfortable. As I got older, the weird things didn't stop. I'd still hear the whispers. I'd still wake up to my closet door open when I was sure I had closed it. Sometimes I'd see things in the corners of my eyes, dark shapes, moving just out of sight, but I learned to ignore it. I had to. If I let it get to me, I'd never sleep. Years passed. By the time I was a teenager, I barely thought about it anymore. The noises, the shadows, the feeling of something watching me, it was just part of life. I didn't talk about it, didn't tell anyone. What was the point? Then, when I was about 16, my mom went to a psychic. She wasn't the type to do that. She never believed in psychics, thought they were all scammers. But for some reason, she went. I don't know if she was just curious, or if something had been bothering her. She never really explained why. She told me about it when she got home. She looked shaken, like something had genuinely scared her. The psychic told her she was supposed to have 3 children. That was true. She had 2 miscarriages, one before I was born, one after. But then the psychic asked if she had an older teenage son. When my mom said yes, the psychic got this strange look on her face. She said there was something following me. Not a ghost, not a demon, just something. A presence, a spirit, whatever you want to call it. The psychic said it had been there for years, ever since I was little. That it wasn't just hanging around, it was following me. My mom didn't know what to think. She came home and told me everything. That's when she finally told me about Henry, about the Ouija board, about everything she had kept from me my whole life. I didn't know what to say. What do you even do with information like that? I didn't believe in ghosts. I still don't, but I knew something was wrong. I had always known. After that, things got worse. The noises got louder. The footsteps in the hall weren't just soft anymore. They were heavy, deliberate. The scratching in the walls turned into knocking, like something was inside, trying to get out. I started seeing things, but not just in the corners of my eyes anymore. Dark shapes at the end of the hall. The feeling of someone standing behind me when I was alone. My bedroom door opening on its own, not slowly, but suddenly, like someone had pushed it. One night, I woke up to my bed shaking. Not violently, but just enough to wake me up. When I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't moving. It was just there. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just closed my eyes and waited for it to go away. The next morning, my mom found scratches on my bedroom door. Deep, jagged scratches, like something had clawed at it. That was the breaking point. She got rid of everything, old furniture, old toys, anything that had been in the house for a long time. She even got rid of the Ouija board, even though it had been packed away for years. And then, just like that, everything stopped. The noises went away. The shadows disappeared. The feeling of being watched was gone. It was like someone had flipped a switch. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was all in my head, if it was just childhood paranoia, if my mind was playing tricks on me. But I do know that for the first time in my life, I felt normal. The house was quiet. I could sleep without waking up to strange noises. I stopped feeling like there was something right behind me every time I turned around. Maybe my mom was right. Maybe she did something by getting rid of everything. Or maybe whatever was there, whatever had been following me for years, finally decided to leave. I don't know, and I don't want to know. All I know is that after that, I never saw or heard anything strange again. I was somewhere between Kansas City and Tulsa when the exhaustion hit me. The long, straight stretches of highway had a way of dulling my senses, the endless miles of pavement rolling under my tires, the occasional highway sign the only thing breaking up the monotony. It had been a long day. I had worked a full shift before heading out, figuring I'd rather push through the drive late at night than waste daylight tomorrow. It wasn't the smartest decision, but I'd done it before. I thought I could handle it. But sometime past midnight, my eyelids started getting heavy. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, my shoulders tense. I rolled down the window to get some air, but the wind whipping past my face only seemed to lull me further. My body was shutting down, the fatigue weighing on me like bricks stacked on my chest. My blinks got longer. Each time my eyes closed, they stayed shut for a fraction of a second too long. I told myself I'd make it to the next exit. Just one more stretch of highway. But the signs were few and far between out here, and I had no idea how far I was from a gas station or rest stop. It felt like there was nothing but empty road and darkness ahead. My vision blurred for a second, the lines on the road stretching unnaturally. I blinked hard, my head snapping back up. That was it. I couldn't push through this. I was going to crash if I didn't stop. There wasn't an exit in sight, no shoulder wide enough to pull over safely, just an empty strip of land running alongside the road. No cars in my rearview mirror. No headlights ahead. The highway was dead. I slowed down and eased the car onto the narrow strip of gravel beside the road. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I put the car in park and took a deep breath. My heart was pounding too fast for how tired I felt. I locked the doors out of habit. The car was still running, the dash lights casting a dim glow inside. Leaning the seat back, I shifted to get comfortable. The night was quiet, the only sounds the occasional rush of wind and the distant hum of the engine. My body sank into the seat, my fingers unclenching from where they had been gripping the steering wheel too tight. The exhaustion was bone deep, and as soon as I closed my eyes, sleep took me. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up. A loud noise snapped me out of unconsciousness, my heart lurching into a frantic rhythm. The car was surrounded. Shapes moved outside the windows, figures pressed against the glass. My brain couldn't make sense of it at first. There were too many of them. Hands slammed against the windows. Fists pounded against the doors. The whole car shook with the force of it. The faces outside were contorted in the dim light, shadows stretching their features in strange, twisted shapes. Their mouths were moving, but I couldn't hear what they were saying over the sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. They were shouting, screaming, their fists beating against the car like they were trying to break through the glass. Panic surged through me. My breath came in ragged gasps. My hands fumbled for the keys, for the door lock, for anything. My body was frozen, trapped in the nightmare playing out around me. And then, I woke up. For real this time. I sucked in a sharp breath, my entire body jolting as if I had been electrocuted. My pulse was thundering, my skin slick with sweat. My fingers dug into the seat, my muscles locked so tight it felt like I had been paralyzed. The car was empty. The windows were clear. There was no one outside. No one beating against the glass. No shouting. No fists slamming against the doors. Just the night. Silent. Still. The only sound was my own breathing, heavy and uneven. The dream still clung to me. The panic so real I could still feel the weight of it pressing against my chest. I checked the time. It had been less than 10 minutes since I had shut my eyes. Something in me screamed to leave. I didn't question it. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, and I slammed the car into drive. Gravel kicked up behind me as I pulled back onto the highway, my heart still racing. I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see something, anything, out there in the darkness. There was nothing. I kept my foot on the gas, gripping the wheel tight, my body still wired with adrenaline. I wasn't superstitious. I never had been. But something about that dream, about the way it had yanked me out of sleep, the way I had woken up feeling like I had just barely escaped something, felt like more than just my brain playing tricks on me. I didn't stop driving. Not until I reached Tulsa. I don't know what to call it. A dream, a hallucination, a vision. Whatever it was, it happened maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and even now, I still think about it sometimes. It wasn't just a nightmare or some passing thought that disappeared when I woke up. It felt real. It felt like something that actually happened, and no matter how much time passes, I can't seem to shake it. It started like any other night. I remember feeling drained that evening, not because of anything unusual, just regular exhaustion from a long day. I had been working a lot back then, barely keeping up with everything, running on fumes. I don't remember exactly what I had been doing that day, but it was the usual. Waking up, going through the motions, coming home, eating something simple, scrolling through my phone until my eyes felt too heavy to keep open. Eventually, I turned off the lights and let sleep take over. I don't know how long I had been out before it happened. There was no sudden noise, no sharp jolt awake, no feeling of falling that sometimes yanks you out of sleep. One moment, I was unconscious, lost in whatever meaningless dreams I had been having, and the next, I wasn't. My eyes were open, and my room was dark except for the faint orange glow of the streetlight filtering through my blinds. It wasn't enough to fully light the room, just enough to cast soft, stretching shadows over the walls and furniture. At first, I thought I had just woken up normally. My body felt heavy, my head groggy, my thoughts sluggish, the way they always do when I drift out of sleep in the middle of the night. I barely moved, just lay there, staring blankly ahead, waiting to drift back under. But then I noticed something. A shape. A figure. Someone standing over me. It took a second for my brain to catch up, to process what I was looking at, but once it did, my chest tightened. My breath caught in my throat. My heart thudded once, hard. It was her. My ex. She was just there, standing over me, watching me. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just stared back, frozen in place, struggling to understand what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. She shouldn't have been there. I hadn't seen her in years, hadn't thought about her. I had no feelings left toward her, good or bad. There was no reason for her to be there, but she was. The way she stood, it wasn't right. It wasn't normal. She wasn't just standing beside my bed like a regular person. She was too close, leaning over me, her head tilted down, her face inches from mine. Her body was still, too still, as if she wasn't even breathing. The way she looked at me, blank, expressionless, unreadable, sent something cold slithering through my stomach. I wanted to move. I wanted to sit up, to shift away, to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My limbs felt like dead weight, locked in place. My throat was tight, as if I had forgotten how to swallow. I didn't know what was happening, but the only thing I could do was stare back at her. And then she spoke. 2 words. Let go. Her voice was quiet, flat, completely devoid of emotion. But there was something about the way she said it, something off, something wrong. It didn't sound like a suggestion or advice. It sounded like a command, like a demand. And then she was gone, just like that. I don't remember her walking away. I don't remember her fading or disappearing. One moment she was there, and the next she wasn't. My room was empty, silent, still. I sat up fast, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. My chest felt tight, my skin clammy, my body shivering despite the fact that my room wasn't cold. My sheets were damp with sweat. I ran a hand over my face, trying to calm myself down, trying to shake the feeling that she was still there, just out of sight, just waiting. I turned on the light. The room looked exactly the same as always. My clothes were still draped over the chair in the corner. My phone was still plugged in on the nightstand. The door was still shut. There was no sign that anyone had been there. But it didn't feel right. I got out of bed, paced around the room, checked my phone. It was around 3 in the morning. Too late to be awake, too early to start the day. I wanted to go back to sleep, but the thought of lying down again, closing my eyes, slipping back into that darkness, it made my skin crawl. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of it. It had to have been a dream. That was the only logical explanation. A dream, or maybe sleep paralysis. People talk about seeing strange figures when they wake up in the middle of the night, frozen and unable to move. That had to be it. Just my brain playing tricks on me. But it hadn't felt like a dream. It had felt real. The heaviness of her presence. The way she looked at me. The sound of her voice. It was burned into my mind with a clarity that dreams never have. And the worst part was, I had no reason to dream about her. We hadn't been together for years. I hadn't even thought about her. There was no lingering bitterness, no unresolved feelings, nothing. So why had she been there? And why had she told me to let go? I never told anyone about it. It felt too strange, too stupid, too meaningless to bring up in conversation. What would I even say? Hey, I had a really weird dream about my ex-girlfriend standing over my bed and telling me to let go. What do you think it means? It sounded ridiculous. But even though I never talked about it, I never forgot it. Even now, years later, it still creeps into my mind when I least expect it. I'll be lying in bed, about to fall asleep, and suddenly I'll remember the way she stood over me, the way she stared at me, the way her voice sounded when she spoke. I'll wake up in the middle of the night, the room dark and quiet, and for a split second, I'll expect to see her there again. I don't know what it was. A dream, a hallucination, my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just one of those weird things that happen, something unexplainable, something I'll never get an answer to. But I still think about it, and I still don't understand. The air outside was cooler than I expected. I stepped barefoot onto the concrete porch, the smooth surface still warm from the sun that had beaten down on it all day. The street in front of our house was quiet, the kind of small-town silence that always felt just a little too empty, like the world had gone to sleep and left me behind. The single street lamp on the corner flickered like it always did, buzzing softly. A few moths flitted around the light, their shadows stretching and shrinking against the pavement. I pulled my hoodie tighter around me and stepped off the porch into the yard. The grass was cool, a little damp from the evening humidity, and the smell of dry earth and cut grass still lingered from when my dad mowed earlier. I stopped a few feet from the door and cupped my hands around my mouth. "Here, kitty kitty," I called, my voice barely breaking the stillness. My cat was usually good about coming back when she was supposed to. She scratched at my window screen when she wanted in, and most nights, she had a way of showing up right when I started to feel uneasy, as if she knew I needed her. Tonight, though, she hadn't come back yet, and for some reason, it was bothering me more than usual. I took another step forward, scanning the shadows near the bushes. The yard wasn't big, just a stretch of grass between the porch and the sidewalk, with a couple of overgrown flower beds my mom had given up on years ago. Past that was the road, empty except for a single parked truck a few houses down. I called for her again, my voice a little louder this time. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and the sound of a TV drifted through a neighbor's open window. I waited, straining to hear the soft jingle of my cat's collar, but the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I sighed. She'd come back when she was ready. She always did. I turned toward the house, already thinking about getting back inside, maybe grabbing a snack before heading to my room. My foot lifted off the grass, and I saw him. He was close. Too close. Less than 2 feet behind me. Everything inside me locked up at once. My breath caught in my throat, my arms stiffened at my sides, and a slow, creeping chill spread down my back. For a second, I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The man just stood there. His face was lined, deep wrinkles cutting across his forehead and around his mouth. His skin looked rough, weathered. His clothes were nondescript, dark, loose-fitting. I couldn't tell how old he was, but he wasn't young. Maybe 60s, maybe older. His eyes were on me, blank but focused, like he had been standing there for a long time, waiting for me to turn around. The street lamp's weak glow barely reached us, but I could see enough. I felt the world tilt under me. My ears started ringing, my skin burned cold, and my stomach twisted so hard I thought I might throw up. I don't know how long we stood there. A second. 2. It felt like minutes. I forced my body to move. I turned. I walked. Not too fast. Not too slow. My legs felt weak, like I might collapse if I moved too suddenly, but I kept going. The porch was only a few steps away. The door was open. I had left it cracked when I came out. My parents were inside. I could hear the faint murmur of the TV. I reached the steps. My bare foot hit the first one, then the second. I was inside. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click. I was shaking. My whole body trembled, but I didn't know if it was from fear or adrenaline or something worse. My stomach was still knotted. My arms felt weightless, disconnected. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Then I turned and looked through the small window beside the door. He was gone. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't heard anything. But the yard was empty. The sidewalk was empty. The street was empty. I forced myself to breathe. I wanted to tell my parents. I should have told them. But something inside me locked up again. I was afraid. Not just of the man. Of something deeper. I didn't know why. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe I didn't want them to panic. Maybe I didn't want to admit how real it had been. I stood there for what felt like forever. My breath started to even out. My hands steadied. I could still feel the grass under my feet, the weight of the night pressing in around me. I told myself it was over. I told myself I was safe now. But the fear didn't go away. It got worse. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized. There was no reason for him to be there. I had never seen that man before. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone. My mom and grandma were practically local celebrities. If he was a neighbor, I would have recognized him. If he was visiting someone, there would have been a car, a light on, something. But there had been nothing. And the way he stood there, so still, so close, without making a sound. He hadn't been walking by. He hadn't been lost. He hadn't been looking for someone. He had been standing there, behind me, waiting. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step away from the door. I made my way to my room, closing the door behind me even though I knew it wouldn't really help. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up, listening to every creak of the house. I waited for my cat to come back. She never did. At least, not that night. I was 7 years old when my sister and I were first allowed to go to the park down the street by ourselves. It wasn't far from our house, just a few blocks away, and right next to the church. My sister was 8, only a year older, but at that age, she might as well have been an adult to me. She was the one who made the decisions, who decided when it was time to go home, who would be the one to explain things if we got in trouble. The park itself wasn't much, just a patch of grass with some rusting swings and a slide, half covered in graffiti. The wooden benches were cracked, and the picnic tables had cigarette burns and carvings from kids who had been there long before us. If you looked close, you could find broken beer bottles mixed in with the gravel, and sometimes needles. You had to be careful where you stepped. We knew the rules. Never touch anything sharp, never pick up anything that wasn't ours, never go near the bushes if there was movement inside. If someone called out to us, we ignored it. If a black Lincoln Town car came rolling down the street, we ran. Adults didn't ask kids for help. If one did, it was because they wanted to grab us. That was what our mother told us. Still, we went there often. It wasn't like we had a backyard to play in. The apartment we lived in was cramped, and being outside, even in a place like that, was better than sitting around in a hot room with nothing to do. We played on the swings, ran races in the dirt, and looked for coins in the grass. That was our favorite thing. Hunting for what we called drunk change, the nickels and dimes that fell out of pockets when someone was too far gone to notice. If we found enough, we'd take it to the little convenience store down the block and get ourselves some candy or a soda. It never added up to much, but when you didn't have anything, even a few cents felt like something. That day, we were doing just that, digging through the bushes, pulling aside crushed beer cans and cigarette butts, looking for anything that might have fallen loose from someone's pocket the night before. It was summer, and it was hot. The sun was starting to dip down behind the buildings, but the air still felt thick. The asphalt on the street shimmered with the last of the heat. I heard it first. A sound I didn't understand at first, a mix of coughing and something else. Crying. I froze, looking at my sister, but she hadn't heard it yet. She was busy pushing aside some twigs, her small fingers picking through the dirt. The sound came again, and this time she heard it too. We stood up, brushing dust from our knees, and turned toward the church. He was there, curled up against the wall, half hidden in the shadow of the building. At first, I thought he was just another drunk, someone who had passed out there overnight, but when we got closer, I saw the blood. It was everywhere, dried in streaks across his face, fresh on his arms, smeared into his clothes. His jeans were black, but even in the dim light, I could see the darker stains that soaked the fabric. His shirt had once been blue plaid, but it was torn, the fabric hanging loose where it had been cut. His hands were shaking, his fingers curled in like claws, and he was mumbling something to himself, something I couldn't understand. His face was a mess. Cuts, bruises, swelling. It was like someone had taken something heavy and smashed it into him over and over again. But what scared me the most wasn't the blood or the injuries. It was the way he was crying. I had never seen a man cry before. Not like that. My sister hesitated, but then she turned to me. "Stay with him," she said. "I'll get help." And then she was running, her small legs carrying her away, back down the street toward home. I stood there, looking down at the man. He hadn't even noticed her leave. He was still shaking, still rocking slightly where he sat, his head pressing against the brick wall of the church like he thought it could help him somehow. His lips moved, and I started to pick out words, though they didn't make much sense to me at the time. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Please, I'm sorry." His voice cracked, and he coughed again, his whole body shuddering with the effort. His breath smelled like blood and something else, something sickly sweet. He was apologizing over and over, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know what to do. I had never touched that much blood before, and I didn't want to touch it now. My mom had told me about diseases, about how you couldn't always see them, how they could get inside you without you knowing. So I kept my hands to myself, pressing them against my shorts, but I didn't leave. I told him that help was coming. I said it over and over again, not sure if he could even hear me. The sun kept dropping lower. I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood, the distant hum of cars, the occasional shout of someone calling down the street. A dog barked somewhere behind the church, and the man flinched like the sound hurt him. I kept waiting for my sister to come back. She didn't. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, I heard footsteps on the pavement. When I turned, I didn't see her. I saw an old woman instead, standing on the sidewalk in front of the church, staring at us. I recognized her. She lived on the corner, in the divided house with the sagging porch. She knew who I was, knew I wasn't supposed to be there, and I saw her mouth press into a thin line before she turned and walked back inside. I didn't know she had called the police until I heard the sirens. Red and blue lights flashed against the brick, and then 2 cops were there, stepping out of the car, looking between me and the man slumped against the wall. One of them told me to go home. Just like that, like I was in trouble. I hesitated, looking at the man, but he hadn't moved. He was still shaking, still curled up, still whispering to himself. The cops didn't look at him like I had. They didn't kneel down to ask if he was okay. They just pulled him up, his legs barely holding him, and shoved him into the back of the car. The door slammed shut, and then they were gone. I walked home alone. When I got back, my sister was playing in the yard like nothing had happened. She had forgotten about me. I didn't tell my mom. The next day, we went back to the park. The bushes were gone. All of them, chopped down to nothing, leaving behind only broken stumps and scattered leaves. The pine trees that lined the edge of the lot had been trimmed too, the lower branches taken off, so no one could hide there anymore. It wasn't just the bushes we had been digging through, it was the whole park. The city had come through overnight and stripped it bare. I didn't ask why. I already knew. We never talked about it again. A week later, they finally sprayed the blood off the side of the church. It took them that long to get around to it. By then, it was just another thing that had happened, just another part of the neighborhood. People moved on, but I never forgot. I never saw that man again. I don't know what happened to him. I don't think I ever will. I grew up on a farm in Nebraska, miles away from any neighbors, surrounded by vast stretches of land that seemed endless. The nights were dark, darker than anything you'd find in a town or city, with no streetlights, no glow from distant houses, just the thick blackness of the countryside. On cloudy nights, when the moon was hidden, stepping outside felt like walking into a void. That night, I was home alone. My parents had gone to visit my aunt and uncle, and my younger siblings had tagged along, leaving me with the house to myself. At 17, I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. The house was old, built by my grandfather decades ago, with heavy wooden doors and thick walls that creaked in the wind. It was sturdy, but had that unsettling way of settling at night, making noises that were easy to explain in the daytime, but took on a different feeling when you were alone in the dark. I went to bed around 10. There was no reason to stay up late. The days on the farm were long, and even though I wasn't expected to wake up early the next morning, my body was used to a routine. I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and closed my eyes. The wind outside was strong that night, whistling through the trees and rattling the windows slightly, but it was a familiar sound. It didn't bother me. At some point, I started dreaming. It wasn't a normal dream, not the kind that fades the second you wake up. This one stuck with me, vivid, clear, the kind of dream that feels real while you're in it. In the dream, I was lying in my bed, exactly as I had been when I fell asleep. The room looked the same. The only difference was that something felt off. The air was heavier, thicker, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, soft against the wooden floor, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anything, but I knew they were coming down the hall, heading toward my door. Each step was careful, measured, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking didn't want to be heard, but couldn't avoid making noise entirely. I lay there, completely still, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps got closer. They reached my door. Then they stopped. Silence. I wanted to move, to get up, to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I just lay there, frozen, listening. A few seconds passed. Then slowly, the door began to open. No creak, no rush of movement, just a slow, deliberate shift as the door swung inward. I jolted awake. My heart was racing, my skin damp with sweat. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I realized I was in my room, in my bed, and everything was exactly as it should be. The door was closed. I let out a long breath, trying to shake off the lingering unease. It had only been a dream. A bad one, sure, but just a dream. I turned onto my side, pulling the blankets up, and tried to calm myself. The house was quiet except for the wind outside. Everything was normal. I told myself that, repeated it in my head like a mantra. Everything was normal. It had just been a dream. Then I heard it. A creak. A quiet, unmistakable sound coming from my door. My stomach dropped. My skin went cold. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes darted toward the door. It was moving. The handle hadn't turned. No footsteps had preceded it. But the door was slowly, steadily opening. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I threw the blankets aside and lunged, crossing the room in a split second. I grabbed the door and slammed it shut with all my strength. The sound echoed through the house, loud enough that if someone had been outside, they would have heard. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, and I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. With one shaking hand, I reached for the lock and twisted it. The solid click was reassuring, but it didn't make me feel safe. For a few seconds, I just stood there, gripping the doorknob so hard my fingers ached. I listened, strained to hear anything beyond my own pounding heartbeat. But there was nothing. No movement. No sounds. Just silence. I turned and flipped on the light. The sudden brightness stung my eyes, but I didn't care. I needed to see. The room was empty. I opened the closet, checked under the bed. Nothing. Then I stepped back, still breathing hard, and stared at the door. I had locked it. I was sure of that. I had locked it just before going to bed. The handle was stiff, and I always double-checked before sleeping, just out of habit. And yet, it had opened. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe the wind had pushed it, but the windows were closed. Maybe the latch hadn't caught properly, but I knew it had. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, heart still pounding. The hallway was empty. The house was empty. I checked every room, turned on every light. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No windows open. No reason for the door to have moved on its own. I went downstairs, pacing the kitchen, trying to calm down. Every logical part of my brain told me it had been nothing. A coincidence. A trick of the mind, still shaken from the dream. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing outside my door. That something had been there, listening, waiting. I didn't go back to my room that night. I stayed downstairs, lights on, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I barely touched. Every so often, I'd glance at the stairs, half expecting to see movement at the top. The hours crawled by. Eventually, just before dawn, I heard my parents' car pulling up the gravel driveway. I met them at the door. I didn't tell them what happened. What could I say? That my door had opened on its own? That I had a nightmare, and then woke up to something I couldn't explain? They would have said I imagined it, that I was half asleep and misremembered. Maybe they would have been right. But even now, after all these years, I still think about that night. And I still don't have an explanation. Kmart always smelled the same. Stale air conditioning, plastic, and that weird scent that clung to the aisles full of clothes, cheap toys, and packaged food. It was a Saturday afternoon, and my mom had dragged me and my two stepbrothers along for groceries. I wasn't excited about it, but at least Kmart had an electronics section. That was always the best part of coming here. The giant wall of TVs, video game displays, and shelves lined with DVDs I'd never buy, but liked to look at anyway. The store was bright, the lights reflecting off the polished floor, making everything feel overly artificial. It wasn't packed, but there were enough people moving around, carts squeaking down the aisles, muffled announcements coming through the speakers, and checkout scanners beeping constantly. As soon as we walked in, my stepbrothers and I peeled off toward electronics. My mom didn't bother stopping us. She knew we'd find her when she was done. They ran off toward the video game section, but I didn't care about that today. I just wanted to stand in front of the giant TV display and watch whatever was playing. I walked past rows of DVDs, past the glass cases where they locked up the expensive electronics, and made my way to the back wall where the TVs were. A whole grid of them, stacked in neat rows, all playing the same thing. It looked like some nature documentary: blue ocean, coral reefs, fish darting through the water. The colors were so bright and crisp it almost felt like I could reach out and touch the water. I stood there watching, my mind kind of going blank, just zoning out, letting the hum of the store fade into the background. I wasn't really thinking about anything, just watching. Then, out of nowhere, I felt two large hands slam down on my shoulders. My whole body jolted, a shock running straight through me. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat. I felt thick fingers pressing hard, gripping me so tightly I could feel the weight of them through my t-shirt. It wasn't just a light touch or someone tapping me to get my attention. This was forceful, heavy, controlling. I wanted to spin around, but I couldn't. The grip held me in place, fingers digging into my shoulders like they were meant to keep me still. "You have something on you." The voice was right behind me, deep and unfamiliar. For a split second, my brain scrambled for an explanation. Did I bump into someone? Did I brush past something without realizing? Was there actually something on my back? A bug? A spider? Something dangerous? I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. His grip was too strong. My body wasn't responding the way I wanted it to. It was like I had completely lost control. Panic started bubbling up inside me, but I couldn't scream. My mouth felt like it had locked shut. I wanted to turn, to run, to do something, but my feet wouldn't move. I was stuck in place, frozen like a deer caught in headlights. Then I heard a faint click. I didn't know what it was at first. My brain wasn't working fast enough to connect the dots. But a second later, his hands lifted off my shoulders, and he just walked away. I finally turned my head, heart hammering in my chest, and saw him disappearing down the aisle. A grown man, tall, wearing jeans and some plain t-shirt, blending in like he was just another shopper. He wasn't running. He wasn't acting guilty. He just walked away like nothing had happened. I stood there, completely still, my whole body tense. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter and tighter as realization hit me like a freight train. He had taken a picture. Of me. Of my butt. I was in shorts. Just a regular t-shirt and shorts, nothing weird, nothing that should have drawn attention. But that didn't matter. That wasn't the point. He had grabbed me, held me still, and then took a picture. I felt sick. I didn't know what to do. My whole body felt hot and cold at the same time. My hands were shaking, my legs were shaking, but I still couldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but I didn't know what. Tell someone? But who? I didn't even know where my mom was. And what if she got mad at me? What if she said it was my fault for not stopping him? What if she yelled at me for not saying something right away? I forced myself to start walking. My legs felt weird, like they weren't fully under my control. But I made it back to where my stepbrothers were, still messing around in the video game section like nothing had happened. I didn't say anything to them. I just stood there, stomach in knots, feeling like I was going to throw up. I had never felt fear like that before. That kind of fear that makes you completely useless. I always thought in scary situations I'd be able to fight back, to scream, to do something. But I had done nothing. I had just stood there. I followed my stepbrothers as they wandered back toward the front of the store. Eventually, we found my mom in the grocery section. I walked next to her as she pushed the cart, still not saying a word. The fear didn't go away. It just sat there, twisting inside me, making my skin crawl. I kept glancing around, scanning the aisles, looking for him, but I didn't see him anywhere. I could have told her. I could have gone to an employee, to security, to anyone, but the words wouldn't come out. It felt too late. By the time I even thought about doing something, he was probably already gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt those hands slam down on my shoulders again. I heard that click. I never told anyone. Not my mom. Not my stepbrothers. Not anyone. And that's what haunted me the most. Not what he did, but what I didn't do. Because what if I let some pedophile walk away? What if he went on to do something worse? What if I had been the only person who could have stopped him? I got off easy. I know I did. It could have been so much worse. But that doesn't make it any easier to live with. It's been years, but I still think about it sometimes. That feeling of being completely frozen. That click of a camera. And the sickening thought that somewhere, out there, that picture still exists. The sun was high, but it wasn't too hot yet. It was one of those early summer afternoons when everything felt slow and heavy, but not in a bad way, just lazy, like the world was waiting for something to happen. I was 8, and so was my best friend. We were in her front driveway, skipping rope and making up little games like we always did. Her house was on a quiet street, the kind where cars didn't pass by often, where neighbors sat on porches or worked in their yards, where the biggest excitement of the day might be a stray cat walking down the sidewalk. It felt safe. She had one of those jump ropes with plastic beads covering the cord, making a loud clacking sound every time it hit the pavement. We were taking turns, one of us jumping while the other counted, though we never kept track for long before getting distracted by something else. Little kids don't have much of an attention span. 1 second, we were counting jumps. The next, we were arguing over who could skip the fastest. Then we were hopping from one chalk-drawn square to another, making up some game on the spot. We were completely in our own world. I don't know when I first noticed the truck. Maybe I heard the tires slowing on the pavement. Maybe I caught a glimpse of blue out of the corner of my eye. Or maybe it was just the feeling that something was wrong before I even turned to look. But there it was, idling at the curb. A small blue pickup, not new, not falling apart, just there, too still. The driver's window was rolled down. He was staring at us. I stopped moving. My friend didn't notice at first. She was still jumping, focused on the rhythm of her feet hitting the driveway. Clack, clack, clack. She didn't even look up when he spoke. His voice was deep, too deep for a kid's game. Too deep for the soft, lazy afternoon. It cut through the air, heavy and wrong. I didn't hear the words at first. Maybe I wasn't listening. Maybe I was too busy staring at him, trying to make sense of why he was there. He was older than my dad, with dark hair and a face that looked like it had seen too much sun. His arm was resting on the door, one hand on the wheel. His fingers were tapping against the metal, slow and even, like he had all the time in the world. He said something again. My friend finally looked up, pushing a stray curl out of her face. I felt my stomach drop. I don't know how I knew, but I did. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be talking to us. He asked for directions. I don't remember where to. I don't think it mattered. What kind of grown man stops his truck to ask 2 little girls for directions? Something in me snapped to attention. My mind wasn't moving fast, but my body was. I took a step back, just one, just enough to feel the pavement under my heels. I wanted to turn and run straight for the front door, but I didn't. My friend was still standing there, rope in one hand, staring at him like she was trying to make sense of his words. I hissed her name under my breath. She didn't react. She took a step forward. I wanted to grab her, yank her arm, scream for her mom, do anything to make her stop, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. My heartbeat was in my throat, loud and pounding, but my body wouldn't move fast enough. She took another step. I took another step back. She was closer to the truck now. Not close enough to touch it, but too close for comfort. The man didn't move, didn't reach out, didn't do anything but watch her with a face that didn't belong on this street. Not in this moment, not near us. My hands were clenched into fists. I was shaking. I think that's when he noticed me. I wasn't moving toward him. I wasn't smiling or talking or answering his question. I wasn't stepping closer like my friend. I was frozen, halfway between her and the front door, staring right at him. My face probably pale and tight, and full of something I didn't even have a name for yet. I didn't blink. His fingers stopped tapping. For a second, no one moved. The street was quiet. No cars, no voices, no wind, nothing but the sound of my own breathing in my ears. Then he shifted. He pulled his arm back inside the truck. Then, just like that, he drove away. Not fast, not slow, just gone. I ran inside before the dust settled. My friend was still standing in the driveway, watching the truck disappear down the street. She turned to look at me, confusion flickering across her face. She didn't understand. I ran past her, through the front door, into the house, straight to where her mom was sitting in the living room. I was panting, pointing toward the window, trying to find the words to explain, to make her understand. By the time she got up and walked outside, the truck was long gone. My friend just shrugged. Nothing happened. She went back to playing like it was just another summer day. Like nothing had changed. But something had. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know if he had a plan. Maybe he was just an idiot, a clueless man who really thought 2 8-year-olds could give him directions. Maybe he was harmless. But I don't think so. I don't think I'll ever know for sure. But I do know one thing. He was watching us. And when he saw me staring back, When he saw that I wasn't smiling or stepping closer or playing along, he left. I don't know why. Maybe I scared him. Or maybe he just changed his mind. I think about it sometimes, about what might have happened if I hadn't been there. If my friend had been playing alone that day. If she had stepped just a little closer. But I don't like to think about that for too long. Because nothing happened. At least, nothing that I can prove. I woke up choking. The nightmare was already fading, but the feeling it left behind was real, too real. My brother's hands, cold and too strong, pressing down on my throat, cutting off the air, cutting off everything. I still felt the pressure, the tightness, the terror of knowing I was dying and couldn't stop it. But nightmares ended. That was the only good thing about them. I knew the relief that came after, the way I'd wake up and take that first deep breath and feel safe again. I took that breath, or I tried to. Nothing happened. I tried again, sucking in, expecting that rush of fresh air, expecting to feel my lungs open up. Instead, my chest locked tight. My throat wouldn't work. I couldn't pull in anything. I was awake now, wide awake, and I still couldn't breathe. Panic hit me like a fist. My whole body clenched with it, my arms stiff, my stomach twisting in on itself. I scrambled up in bed, grabbing at my own throat, trying to make something work, trying to force the air in, but it wasn't happening. My lungs were empty. The air wasn't coming. My brain didn't work right after that. Everything blurred together. My hands clawed at my neck, my mouth opening, gasping, trying so hard to get something, anything. But there was nothing. I was drowning in my own bed. The fear was pure. It filled every part of me, squeezed my chest even tighter, sent my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think past the need for air. I was going to die. Right there, alone in my bed, just 10 years old. I tried to make a noise, tried to yell or call for help, but my throat wouldn't work. The sound that came out was just a horrible wheezing rasp. It didn't even sound like me. It sounded like something breaking. I don't know how long I fought like that, twisting in my blankets, fingers digging into my own skin, desperate. I wasn't even thinking anymore. My body was just reacting, panicking, desperate to live, desperate to breathe. And then suddenly my dad was there. I don't even remember him coming into the room. 1 second I was choking alone, and the next his hands were grabbing me, pulling me up, lifting me off the bed. I didn't even care what was happening. I couldn't. My brain wasn't working. I just felt movement, felt myself being carried, felt the cool air hit me as we moved. I was still fighting, still trying to drag in a breath. I could hear myself wheezing, feel my chest tightening more with every second. My vision was going blurry, black spots forming in the corners. The world tilted as he carried me. I felt stairs under my feet, but I wasn't walking. Everything felt disconnected, like I wasn't inside my own body anymore. Then suddenly, I wasn't just gasping, I was coughing. My whole body jerked with it, my lungs still refusing to pull in what I needed. My throat burned. I felt my dad's hand on my back, rubbing, pushing, guiding me. I barely noticed where we were. The lights in the house were too bright, making my vision swim. My head was spinning. I just knew we were downstairs, somewhere cooler. My knees hit something hard. The floor. My hands slapped against it as I fell forward, chest heaving, body trembling with the force of the attack. I didn't even realize my dad was still there, holding on to me, steadying me. I barely noticed anything past the panic. Then slowly something shifted. It wasn't a full breath, not yet. But there was something. A little less tightness. A little more space in my chest. I was still gasping, still fighting for it, but it wasn't just nothing anymore. I latched onto it, focusing on that tiny change, trying to make it happen again. My throat still felt like it was being crushed, but there was a crack in whatever had locked it up. I coughed again, hard. It felt like my whole body was trying to flip itself inside out. My lungs ached. My throat was raw. But this time, when I sucked in, something actually came in. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But more than before. My hands were still shaking. My head felt light, dizzy wrong. But I was breathing. I stayed there on the floor, head hanging down, my forehead nearly touching it, arms shaking under me. My heart was still hammering. The fear wasn't gone, not yet. I still felt like I could stop breathing again at any second. Like it could happen again just as fast. And this time, maybe I wouldn't come back from it. I focused on each breath. In, out. It hurt. My lungs burned. My throat felt scraped raw, like I'd swallowed glass. But the air was coming in now. It was real. I was real. After a while, the panic started to fade, but it left something worse in its place: exhaustion. My whole body felt drained, like I'd been fighting for hours instead of minutes. My muscles were weak, my arms trembling as I pushed myself up a little. My dad was still there. He hadn't let go. His hand was still pressed against my back, steady. I felt shaky. The world still didn't feel real. My breath was uneven, but it was there. I knew what had happened. I knew what it was. Asthma. I'd had attacks before, but not like that. Not like this. This one had been different. For the first time, I really thought I was going to die. Not just in that panicked, irrational way kids sometimes think they will when something bad happens. No, I had felt it, known it. My brain had accepted it. That feeling didn't just go away. Even as my breathing finally evened out, even as my chest stopped clenching so tight, I knew I wasn't going to forget this. It wasn't going to disappear like a normal nightmare. It had burned itself into me, carved itself deep into my brain. I was going to remember this forever.